I keep thinking about the cake. That's the thing my brain won't let go of. Not the screaming from the lobby, not the blood on the carpet outside the Meridian room doors, not the weight of that fire extinguisher in my hands at 2 in the morning, when everything was falling apart. Not even Patrick's face when he finally told me what he'd done. All of that comes second. First, always first, is the cake. It was 3 tiers, white fondant with little gold security badge decorations on it, and the words 30 years, well done, Ray, spelled out in blue icing. Donna had ordered it from the Brennan's Bakery on Kirkwood Street and had it delivered to the hotel that afternoon. And I know this because Walt Pruitt, our head chef, had called me into the kitchen before the party started to show me with this enormous grin on his face, chest out like he'd baked the thing himself, and said, "Your wife is a good woman, Ray. You don't deserve her." And I said, "Walt, I have been saying that for 31 years. And he laughed, and I laughed, and the kitchen smelled like butter and garlic and warm bread rolls coming out of the oven for the buffet table. And it was 6:45 on a Friday evening in April, and I was supposed to be retired in 11 hours. That was the last normal moment. I'm fairly sure of it. 6:45, Walt's kitchen, the smell of bread, the 3-tier cake on the stainless steel prep counter. Everything before that was the before. Everything after that started going sideways. I'm going to try and tell this in the right order. I've always been a sequence of events kind of person. 30 years of writing incident reports will do that to you. Date, time, location, what happened, who was involved, what action was taken. Simple, clean, no editorializing. That's what my predecessor, old Howard Reeve, drilled into me when I was 29 years old and fresh to the security manager position, still wide-eyed and a little terrified of the responsibility. He said, "Callahan, the beauty of a good incident report is that it doesn't need you. The facts don't need you to dress them up. Just put them down in order, and they'll tell their own story." I'm not writing an incident report. Howard would hate this. But the sequence of events instinct doesn't turn off just because the world has ended. And so, I'm going to try to put it down in the right order. April 19th, Friday, 7 p.m. The Hartfield Grand Hotel, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. 14th floor. No, wait, that's wrong. 4th floor. The Meridian Room. My retirement party. That's where it started. That's where I was. Let me go back a little further. I've worked at the Hartfield Grand since I was 32 years old. Donna will correct me on this if she reads it. She says 31, because I apparently started in November, and she considers that part of my 31st year. But in my head, it's 32. I came in as a night security supervisor, which is a job title that sounds more impressive than it was. Mostly it meant walking the floors from midnight to 7 a.m., checking that fire doors were closed, making sure nobody was sleeping in the laundry room, occasionally escorting someone who'd had too much from the bar up to their room, and handing them off to whoever answered the door. Low glamour, decent pay, benefits, and I was good at it. Not because I was physically imposing. I'm 5'11" on a good day, and I've never been what anyone would call athletic. Not since my 40s anyway. But because I was calm, always have been. Donna says it's a character flaw, being this calm. She says, "Ray, you could be watching the building fall down, and you'd be writing a checklist." She's not wrong. The Hartfield Grand is a real hotel. Has been since 1923. 12 floors, 240 rooms, 3 restaurants, 2 bars, a conference center, 2 smaller event rooms, and the Meridian Room on the 4th floor, which is the big one. Can seat 220 for a sit-down dinner. High ceilings, chandeliers. Not fake ones, actual crystal ones that are a nightmare to clean and replace. And I know this because every 5 years, I have to coordinate with the maintenance team when they bring in the scaffold. Dark wood paneling on the walls, deep red carpet, which I always thought was an odd choice for a room where people eat and drink, because nothing is harder to get champagne stains out of than deep red carpet. Ask me how I know. Friday night. The Meridian Room, my retirement party. 42 people. I counted them later because that's what I do, I count. 42 people, including myself and Donna. Hotel staff, current and former, some of Donna's friends. My daughter Claire had wanted to come down from Toronto, but she had a work thing she couldn't get out of, and I had told her not to worry about it. I'd be fine. We'd celebrate when I came up to visit in June. My brother Paul couldn't make it either. He's in Phoenix, and he's got knee problems, and flying is its own ordeal. So it was mostly colleagues, people I'd spent 30 years with in this building. People who knew where every service corridor ran, and which elevator was slowest, and that the ice machine on the 9th floor made a sound like a small car engine whenever the ambient temperature dropped below 60. 42 people. That detail matters. Everything that happened afterward was shaped by that number. I want to be specific about the people, because they became everything. Donna Callahan, my wife, 59 years old, retired ER nurse from Allegheny General, who quit when her knees started going, and who is, without any exaggeration, the most competent person I have ever known. If you need someone to apply a tourniquet under pressure, call Donna. If you need someone to make a decision when everything is going wrong simultaneously, call Donna. I married her in 1993, and I have been grateful for it every single day since, including the days when she was furious with me, which are more common than I'd like to admit. Carla Reeves, 38, my assistant security manager. I had trained Carla from the ground up. She started as a security officer when she was 24, and she had climbed every step with her hands and her head, and her sheer bloody-minded refusal to be overlooked. She was going to be the best security manager this hotel had ever seen, better than me, and I had told her so in her performance review 6 months ago. She didn't believe me. She should. Gretchen Oakes, 54, head of housekeeping, 22 years at the Hartfield. Knows every room, every closet, every linen supply, every cleaning supply, every access point. Built like a, well, Gretchen is the kind of person who can move a loaded housekeeping cart up a carpeted ramp by herself without breathing hard. And if you've ever pushed one of those things, you'll understand what that tells you about her. Walt Pruitt, 61, head chef. 37 years in hotel kitchens, last 18 at the Hartfield. Took my retirement party catering personally, as a professional matter of pride. He had a team of 3, Lena Doyle, one of the servers, and 2 junior kitchen staff whose names, I'm going to be honest, I didn't know well. A young woman named Becca, and a guy the others called Skinny Pete, whose real name I never learned. Bobby Nix, 22, bellhop. Bobby had not actually been invited to the party. He had shown up in his uniform, slightly out of breath, and told me he just wanted to stop in and wish me well, because I'd gone to bat for him once, when the previous GM had wanted to fire him over a minor uniform violation. Bobby staying was probably the best decision made that entire evening. Bobby turned out to be the kind of person who is only frightened for about 12 seconds, and then gets on with things. Trish Keller, 47, general manager. The Hartfield had gone through 4 GMs in my 30 years. Trish was the most recent, hired 8 months ago from a Marriott property in Columbus. She was not a bad manager, just a very corporate one. She had a gift for planning events and managing budgets, and absolutely no instinct for genuine crisis. This matters later. Tom Garrity, 56, head of maintenance. Tom knew this building's bones better than anyone except me. He knew where every valve was, every circuit breaker, every access point for every system. He had a key ring that I think contained 112 keys, because I had asked him once and he had counted. 112 keys for one building. Tom was also, I should say, a deeply anxious man by nature. Good at his job, fantastic at his job, but prone to catastrophizing. This became a problem, and also, in a strange way, an asset. Mike Stanton, 34, security officer. He was on duty that night, not at the party. He was supposed to be doing his regular floor checks, but he came and found me about 40 minutes in because of the alerts starting to come through on his radio. Patrick Holt, 36, IT and systems coordinator. This is the one you need to pay attention to. And Dennis Farrow, 60, retired detective with the Pittsburgh PD, who had worked the hotel's neighborhood beat for 15 years and had become friendly with several hotel staff over that time, including me. Dennis was a good man. Dennis had a thick gray mustache and laughed too loud at his own jokes and smelled faintly of Old Spice and had 3 grandchildren whose photos he kept on his phone and showed to anyone who stood still long enough. Dennis was also, though I didn't know it yet, at 6:45, when I was looking at my retirement cake, already dying. I need you to hold that. Dennis was already dying when he walked into my retirement party, and none of us could see it. And the only person in the building who knew was Patrick Holt. And Patrick made a decision about what to do with that knowledge that changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 7 p.m., the Meridian Room. Someone had strung a banner across the far wall. "Congratulations, Chief." They called me Chief around the hotel. Had for years. I had never asked them to, and I had never told them to stop. There's something that happens to your face when 30 people have called you the same nickname for long enough. You forget you're supposed to object to it. Donna was at the table near the windows with her friend Paulette Delaney and Paulette's husband Frank, who had already been into the open bar for 20 minutes before I arrived and was holding a whiskey with the relaxed grip of someone who has been holding whiskeys for 30 years. Frank Delaney was not a bad man. He was a loud man and a sentimental man and a man who had no indoor volume setting, but he was not bad. He had a job in commercial real estate and opinions about sports teams, and a deep, genuine love for his wife that he expressed in the most embarrassing possible ways, mostly by announcing it to people who hadn't asked. Carla had organized most of the event decorations herself. Blue and gold balloons, my idea of hell, aesthetically, but I understood the gesture and kept my mouth shut. The banner, a slideshow running on the screen at the front, with photographs going back to my early years at the hotel, including one from 1996, when I had hair, and Donna is going to be furious with me for mentioning that. A table near the buffet had some framed things, a commendation letter from the city, a framed copy of the hotel's safety certification from last year, a photograph of me with every general manager I'd worked under, and a little card from the current staff that said things like, "Chief will be missed," and "Who's going to yell at us about prop?" And the rest was cut off by the frame, which I thought was hilarious. I was happy. I want to be clear about this, because it matters. I was genuinely, simply happy. I had done my job for 30 years. I had kept the building safe. Nobody had died on my watch. Or rather, a few people had died, because hotels are where people have heart attacks, and where occasionally someone has too many of something, but nothing that could be laid at my feet, nothing I could have prevented. I had a good wife and a good daughter, and a pension that wasn't going to make me rich, but was going to keep me comfortable, and we had plans. Portugal, Donna and I. We had been saying Portugal for 15 years. Finally, we were going to go. April into May. Start in Lisbon, work north. Donna had a binder. Donna had an actual physical binder for the Portugal trip. Printed itineraries, hotel confirmations, restaurant recommendations, a section on public transit. I used to tease her about it. The binder, I'd say, when I could see she was getting stressed. "At least we have the binder." And she'd laugh because she knew it was ridiculous, and she'd made the binder anyway. The binder is still at home, on the kitchen counter. I can still picture exactly where I left it. I had a glass of wine. I talked to Tom Garrity about the East Wing evac upgrade he'd been managing, which was the kind of conversation you have at a retirement party when you've worked together for 20 years, and neither of you really knows how to just socialize without the job as scaffolding. I talked to old Rita Baugh, who had retired from the front desk 3 years before me, and had come back just for this, which meant she'd driven 40 minutes from Oakmont, and she hugged me and said, "You're going to be lost without this place, Ray." And I said, "Rita, I'm going to be in Portugal in 2 weeks." And she said, "Give it a month." She was wrong about the timeline, at least. Mike Stanton found me at around 7:40. I was at the buffet, loading my plate with Walt's roasted chicken because I'd been smelling it for an hour, and I'd held off long enough. Mike came in through the main doors looking like he was trying not to look like he was looking for me, which is a thing security people do. We are trained never to look like we're moving fast, always appear controlled. He said, "Chief, got a second?" I looked at my plate. I looked at him. "It better be interesting," I said. He said, "There are some alerts coming in." This is where I want to stop for a second and explain something about how I process information, because it's relevant. I spent 30 years in security. I spent a significant portion of those years fielding reports of things that turned out to be less than they initially seemed. A noise on the third floor, room service cart with a squeaky wheel, lights in the parking garage at midnight, a couple of teenagers who'd snuck in, a man acting erratically in the lobby at 2 a.m., a guest who'd had a nightmare and was still half asleep. You develop a filter, not because you get lazy. I was never lazy about security, ask anyone, but because you learn to calibrate. You learn the difference between something that needs immediate action and something that needs watching. When Mike said there were alerts, my filter said, "Check it out." Probably nothing. My filter, on this occasion, was wrong. He showed me his radio and his phone. There were notifications coming through the hotel's security alert system, which was tied to the city's emergency broadcast network. Something I'd had Tom's IT guy set up years ago, so we'd get alerts about anything in the surrounding area that might affect the hotel. Road closures, power issues, civil disturbances, that kind of thing. Usually it was construction or a water main. What was coming in wasn't construction. Violent incident reported, Liberty Avenue and 9th, police responding. Multiple reports of erratic persons, downtown corridor. Exercise caution. Alert, Pittsburgh PD requesting additional units, waterfront area. Public advised to avoid area. And then, about 3 minutes later, one that made the hair on my arms stand up. Citywide emergency advisory. All residents advised to shelter in place until further notice. Do not approach erratic or aggressive individuals. Call 911. Shelter in place. I had not seen a shelter-in-place advisory in 30 years of hotel work. Not once. I looked at Mike. He looked at me. I said, "Where's Trish?" He said, "I haven't found her yet." I said, "Find Patrick Holt. I want the exterior cameras up right now." That was 7:47. I remember the time because I looked at my watch when Mike found me, out of habit, and the number stuck. I put my plate down on a nearby table, which I found out the next morning I'd put it down right on top of someone's cardigan, and I was halfway to the door when Dennis Farrow stepped in front of me. "Ray," he said. Big smile. Old Spice. The too loud laugh. "You're not leaving already? We haven't done the speeches yet." I looked at him and I smiled back, because that's what you do. "Just checking on something, Dennis. 5 minutes. He said, "You're retired. Stop checking on things." I said, "Give me 5 minutes." He stepped back and made a theatrical gesture like, "Fine, go ahead." I saw him reach up with his left hand and rub the back of his neck. It was a quick thing. Almost nothing. But I noticed it because it was an odd motion, a little stiff, like something hurt. And because Dennis was the kind of man who was always relaxed in his body, loose-limbed, easy. I filed it and kept walking. I'm going to come back to that gesture. I've thought about it 100 times since. Patrick Holt's workspace, the IT and Systems Coordination Office, was on the second floor, not far from the security manager's office that had been mine for 22 years and would be Carla's starting Monday. Patrick was 23 when I first hired him, fresh out of a tech certificate program, and so nervous on his first day, he'd knocked a coffee onto my keyboard and turned about 4 shades of red. He'd grown up since then. He was a quiet man, Patrick, competent, good at his work. He had the kind of face that was hard to read, not because he was deceptive, but because he'd learned to keep things internal. His ex-wife had told him once, apparently, that being with him was like talking to a brick wall. He'd mentioned this in passing once, while we were troubleshooting the lobby camera system at 11 p.m. The way people mention things they're still carrying, but have learned to carry quietly. I liked Patrick. I trusted his work. When I knocked and came into his office at 7:50, he was already at the cameras. He didn't look up. He said, "I know." I stopped. "You know what?" He said, "The alerts. And, Chief, I need you to sit down." Patrick Holt had worked for me for 13 years, and he had never once asked me to sit down. I closed the door behind me and sat down. He swiveled the monitor toward me. The exterior cameras on this system showed 12 angles: front entrance, both side streets, loading dock, parking garage entry, rooftop access, emergency exit on the east wall, emergency exit on the west wall, the alley behind the hotel, and 3 other positions on the surrounding block. The cameras were decent quality, HD, good night vision. It was still light enough outside that the night vision wasn't needed yet. What I saw on camera 3, the main street in front of the hotel, took me a second to process. There were people on the street. This was normal. It was 7:50 on a Friday evening in downtown Pittsburgh. But these people were moving wrong. Some of them were moving too fast and too directionless, just lurching across the street without looking. Some of them were standing completely still in the middle of the sidewalk, in the way that a person only stands still when something is very wrong with them. And some of them, and this is the part that I sat forward for, were moving toward other people in a way that I didn't have good language for at the time, but that I would now describe as purposeful wrongness. They weren't running. They weren't fleeing. They were just walking at people, and when they reached them, I looked away. I looked at camera 7, which was the east alley. The east alley had 3 of them in it. Camera 9, the west emergency exit. There was one near it, just standing, head tilted. Patrick said, "I've been watching this for about 12 minutes. I said, "Have you called the police?" He said, "I called 911 twice. First time they put me on hold. Second time the line was busy." I said, "What about Trish?" He said, "I was about to come find you." I looked at the screens for another few seconds. I was processing. Date, time, location, what happened, who was involved, what action was taken. My brain was already moving into incident report mode, because that's how I think under pressure, and it's the only thing that keeps me from panicking. I said, "How many guests are at the party right now?" He said, "I don't know. 40 maybe?" I said, 42. "I need you to stay on these cameras. Don't go anywhere. Don't let anyone in here without calling me first. I'm going to talk to Trish. Then I'm coming back." He nodded, and then, as I stood up, he said something I didn't understand at the time. He said, "Chief, about the doors." I said, "What about them?" He opened his mouth and then closed it. He said, Just let me pull up something first. Come back in a few minutes." I didn't have a few minutes. I was already at the door. I said, "Write down what you need to tell me," which is something I used to say in briefings when someone was getting sidetracked. "Just write it down. We'll come back to it." I said it and I walked out, and I have thought about that moment more times than I can count, because if I had stayed, if I had sat back down and let him say it, if I had been 5 minutes slower in getting back to the party. But I wasn't. I went back to the party. And that's when I found out about the doors. I found Trish near the bar, talking to the hotel's accountant, a man named Roger Vidal who had come to the party, and who I liked personally, and had never needed professionally. I pulled her aside and I told her what was happening outside. I kept my voice low. I kept my face neutral. I used the same tone I use when I'm telling a guest that the card they've handed me has been declined. Matter of fact, non-alarmist, but clear. She looked at me and said, "Ray, you're retiring." "Tonight, can't this wait?" I said, "Trish, shelter-in-place advisory, citywide. That's not a small thing." She absorbed this. She was a good manager. I'll give her that. She went from dismissive to focused in about 3 seconds. She said, "Okay, do we lock down?" I said, "We have some time. I want to assess before we disrupt the party. But I need to know who's covering the front desk right now." She said, "Andrea and whoever she's got with her." I said, "Tell Andrea to stop letting people in off the street." Politely. Just, "Walk-in bar service is closed for the evening. Private event. Whatever excuse works." Trish said, "What do I tell the GM?" I said, "You are the GM." She said, "Right." She looked briefly annoyed and then composed herself. "Right, I'll call Andrea." I left her to it and started back toward Patrick's office, cutting through the Meridian room on my way, doing a quick count of heads, still 42, and looking for anything that seemed off inside the room. That's when I noticed the doors. The Meridian room has 4 exit points. The main double doors I'd come in through, on the north wall. A secondary single door on the east wall, which led to a service corridor that connected to the kitchen and the back hallway. An emergency exit on the south wall, heavy steel, push bar, wired to an alarm that would sound if opened without the code. And the fourth, a set of frosted glass double doors on the west wall that were supposed to open into the hotel's main 4th-floor corridor near the elevator bank. I noticed the west doors first, because Frank Delaney was at them. Frank had apparently decided, midway through his 3rd or 4th whiskey, that he wanted to step out and make a phone call. He was pushing against the frosted glass doors, and they weren't moving. He was doing this with the puzzled determination of a man who genuinely cannot understand why a door isn't opening, checking the handle, pushing again, looking around as if the door was playing a trick on him. I crossed the room to him. I said, "Frank." He said, "These damn doors. They're stuck." I said, "Hold on." And I tried the handle myself. Locked. Push bar on the inside was down. I pulled it up, still locked. I tried the key code panel. There was a numeric keypad for staff access, and entered the override. Nothing happened. My stomach went a specific kind of cold. I've felt it maybe 5 times in my career. The feeling that tells you the thing you're looking at is not a mechanical failure, but a decision. Someone has done something to this door. I said to Frank, very calmly, "Go get a drink. This is on me." He laughed and went. I crossed the room to the emergency exit on the south wall. The push bar was physically wedged. Someone had taken a piece of wood, I think it was a decorative door stopper, that had been at the base of the emergency exit, and forced it up into the mechanism. Not sophisticated, but effective. I pulled at it, and it didn't give. I went to the east service door. Same thing. The code panel was dark, powered down, not just locked, but powered down, which was not possible without someone cutting the power to it specifically. I went to the main double doors on the north wall, the ones I'd come in through, and I pushed them. They swung open. I stepped into the 4th-floor corridor and looked at the inner side of the frame. Someone had looped a chain, a thin bicycle-style lock chain, around the external door handles and locked it on the outside. From inside the room, you couldn't see it. From inside, the doors just pushed open like normal. But if you walked out and let them close behind you, and then pulled them shut from the inside of the room, the chain would catch. 42 people, locked inside the Meridian room. My first thought was not the obvious one. My first thought, the security manager thought, was, the chain is on the outside of the door. Whoever did this was on the outside when they did it, which meant they were not in the room with us. My second thought was, or they did it, slipped back in, and they're here. I went back to the main doors, left them open because they were the only functional exit I had, walked back inside, found Carla, and said quietly in her ear, "I need you and Mike, right now. Do not make a fuss." She read my face and nodded and came with me. I pulled the 3 of us into the space near the server's station, out of eyeline of most of the guests, and told them what I'd found. Carla's jaw went tight. Mike put his hand over his mouth and then took it away and said, "Who?" I said, "I don't know yet. Nobody panics. Nobody leaves the room." And then I said the thing that I was going to spend the next several days second-guessing. The shelter-in-place advisory might mean those locked doors just saved 42 people's lives. Don't jump to conclusions. Carla said, "Ray, someone deliberately locked us in." I said, "I know. And until we know why, we treat it as a precautionary measure that someone made without authorization, and we deal with it calmly." She gave me a look that said she thought I was being optimistic. She was right. I went to find Patrick Holt. He was at the cameras. He looked up when I came in. He looked like he hadn't slept in a while, which was strange, because when I'd seen him 2 hours earlier at the start of the party, he'd come by to say hello. He'd seemed fine. I said, "Patrick, the doors." "Yes, yes." I said, "Did you lock the doors?" He said nothing for about 3 full seconds. Then he said, "Yes. I'm going to slow down here because the conversation that followed was the most important conversation of the next several days, and I want to get it right." I sat down in the chair across from him. I didn't reach for the phone to call building security. I didn't grab him or threaten him. I sat down because I am a man who has spent 30 years talking people through difficult things, and the most important thing in that moment was to understand what he'd done and why before I did anything else. I said all 4 exits. He said, "The main doors I didn't get to lock from the inside. I only had the chain. The other 3 I could lock from the code panel." I said, "You have override access." He said, "Systems coordinator." "Yes." I said, "Tell me why." He was quiet. His hands were on the desk and he was looking at the monitor. On the screen, the street outside the hotel was worse than it had been 15 minutes ago. More of them, moving in clusters now toward the front of the building. He said, "Dennis Farrow." I said, "What about Dennis?" He said, "I watched him on camera, arriving. About 40 minutes before the party was scheduled to start. He came in the east entrance, from Garrison Street. He pulled up the footage. It was time-stamped 6:18 p.m. Dennis Farrow, heavy coat, the way he always looked, walking through the east lobby. But on camera, you could see things you can't see face to face, because the camera has a wider angle and no social expectation. Dennis was walking awkwardly. His left arm was held against his side in a way that wasn't natural, like he was guarding something. He paused at the water fountain in the east lobby, and I could see, even on camera, that his hand was shaking. Patrick said, "Keep watching." Dennis reached up to the water fountain, his sleeve pulled back. Even on the camera, even with the resolution, I could see it. The left forearm, something dark, a wound. Patrick said, "I zoomed in when I saw him stop. Here." He pulled up a zoomed still from the footage. The wound on Dennis Farrow's left forearm was not a bruise or a scrape. It was a bite, a human bite, clear, semicircular, deep enough that he'd wrapped it with something, a piece of cloth that looked like it had been torn from his shirt, and the cloth was soaked through. Patrick said, "He got here 6 minutes after the first reports started coming in from Liberty Avenue." The bite location, I looked at the map. It's 2 blocks from Liberty and 9th. I stared at the still image. I said, "You thought he'd been bitten by one of whatever those people outside are." Patrick said, "I called the CDC hotline. The one that was in the emergency broadcast." I said, "There was a CDC hotline in the broadcast." He said, "The full broadcast. On the radio. They put one up fast. I called it at 6:40, before the party even started. They had it going fast, Chief. CDC doesn't go national with a hotline in 20 minutes unless they already know." He handed me a notepad. He'd written down the time of the call, the hold time, and then a name. Agent Whitfield, CDC Emergency Operations. And beneath that, in Patrick's careful handwriting, quarantine protocol. Do not allow ingress or egress from affected locations. Infected individual confirmed at your location. Maintain containment. I read it twice. I said, "They told you to lock us in." Patrick said, "They told me to prevent the infected individual from leaving. They said containment was the priority. They said," she said, Agent Whitfield said, she said, "You do not want to let that person out of that building." I said, "She didn't say what about the 40 other people in there with him." He said quietly, "No. She said the protocol was to contain. She gave me a callback number. I've tried it 6 times. It doesn't go through anymore." I sat with that for a long time. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, through the small frosted pane, I could hear sirens. More than I'd heard since moving to Pittsburgh, more than I'd heard in my life, probably. Patrick said, "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if he left and he spread it, whatever it is, I thought that was worse. And I thought, they said people were coming. They said help was coming." I said, "Who said help was coming?" He said, "Agent Whitfield. She said units were being deployed. She said this was a priority response." I looked at the cameras. No response units on any of the screens. No lights, no barriers, no hazmat. Just the street. And more of them on the street than there had been 10 minutes ago. I said, "Does anyone else know?" He said, "No." I sat back. I had 42 people in a banquet room. I had a man in there who had been bitten by something that was turning people into... I didn't have a word for it yet. I really didn't. It sounds ridiculous now to say I didn't have a word, but I genuinely didn't. I was still in the space where your brain tries to find a rational framework for what you're seeing before it'll let you go to the irrational one. I had locked doors. I had no communication with any authority that was working. I had a city that was coming apart outside. I said, "How long does it take? The change. How long?" Patrick said, "I don't know." I said, "When did he arrive?" 6:18. I looked at my watch. It was 8:17 p.m. 2 hours. I said, "Okay, I need you to pull up a live feed of the Meridian room. Interior cameras." Patrick typed. The room came up on the monitor. I could see the party. People laughing. Donna with her wine. Frank Delaney holding court at the bar. The buffet table, still mostly full because Walt's team had been restocking it. And Dennis Farrow, at the far corner table, sitting by himself now, with his head resting on his hands. I said, "He's isolated himself." Patrick said, "He sat down about 20 minutes ago. I don't think he feels well." I said, "No, I don't imagine he does." I stood up. I said, "Patrick, I need your full cooperation from this moment. Everything you know about this building's systems. Everything." He said, "Yes." I said, "And I need you to not leave this room without telling me first. And I need you to keep watching those cameras and tell me immediately if anything changes, outside or inside." He said, "Chief." I said, "I'm not mad at you," which wasn't entirely true, but was true enough. I don't know if what you did was right or wrong. I genuinely don't know that yet, but I need you working with me, not hiding from me. He nodded. I went back to the party. The next part I have to tell carefully, because I made a choice that I have gone over and over in my head since. I didn't tell everyone. Not immediately, not all at once. Here's why, and you can judge me for it if you want. I have seen what happens when you drop bad news into a crowded room all at once. I have seen it 3 times in my career. Once when we had a gas leak and had to evacuate 8 floors at 2 a.m., and someone said the word explosion, and we had 6 people hurt in the stairs from people pushing. Once when there was a bomb threat that turned out to be nothing, and in the 20 minutes between the call and the all clear, we had 2 guests have panic attacks that required medical attention. And once when a fire started in a service elevator shaft, small fire, quickly contained, but because word spread in the wrong way and the wrong order, we had a guest try to jump from a 2nd floor window because he was convinced the whole building was going. Crowds do not absorb bad news evenly. Some people go calm and useful. A larger number go into a kind of paralysis. A small but dangerous number do something irrational that makes everything worse. And in a locked room with no safe exit option, irrational people are more dangerous than whatever is outside. So I went back in and I found Donna. Donna. I want to tell you something about Donna that is not sentimental, because she would read this and tell me to get to the point. Donna was an ER nurse for 21 years. She has held people together, literally and figuratively, in ways that most people never have to and never will. She has a capacity for taking in bad information and converting it directly into useful action that I have never seen in another human being. She doesn't waste time on feelings until the thing is handled. She deals with the feelings after. I found her at the window table and I sat down next to her and I said, very quietly, "I need you to come with me for a minute." She looked at my face. She said, "How bad?" I said, "Badish." She said, "Give me the badish version right now and the full version when we're away from the table." So I gave her the compressed version in about 30 seconds. Doors locked. Someone outside is infected. City has issued shelter in place. We may be here for a while. She absorbed it. She looked out the window. You could hear the sirens from in here. Now, faint but persistent. She said, "The person at the party who's infected." I said, "Dennis Farrow." She looked at Dennis, across the room, sitting with his head down. She said, "How long?" I said, 2 hours since exposure, maybe. Probably more. She said, "Then we don't have a lot of time." I said, "No." She said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you near Dennis. Discreetly. Watch for changes. Give me 5 minutes warning if you can. And if he gets up to leave." She said, "I'll stall him." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "Ray, go do what you need to do." I went and found Carla and Mike and brought them to the service corridor outside the east wall and told them more of it. Not all of it. Not Dennis specifically. Not yet. Because Carla would want to act immediately, and acting immediately on Dennis was going to cause exactly the kind of room-wide panic I was trying to avoid. I told them about the lockdown, about the outside situation, about the fact that we needed to take stock. Carla said, "We need to get into the security office and the maintenance room." I said, "Security office is on 2. Maintenance access panel is in the service corridor on this floor. Patrick has camera coverage. Tom Garrity is in the room. I need him." Mike said, "Should we tell people?" I said, "Not yet. Give me an hour." Carla gave me the look again. She said, "An hour?" I said, 45 minutes. I want to know what we have and what we're working with before we cause a panic. 45 minutes. She said, "And if something happens before 45 minutes?" I said, "Then we tell people." Something happened in 30. I was in the service corridor with Tom Garrity when we heard it. Tom had been genuinely helpful from the moment I pulled him aside. Because Tom, despite his anxiety, is a man who functions best when there is a specific technical problem to solve. Show Tom Garrity a broken thing and tell him to fix it, and he comes alive. The anxiety is about the unknown, the known, the fixable. That's his element. I had told him we needed to inventory what was in the maintenance access areas on this floor and this corridor. He had his keyring out before I finished the sentence. We were taking stock. Fire extinguishers in their mounts, a storage closet with cleaning supplies, a small mechanical room with the HVAC controls for the 4th floor, some ducting access panels, when we heard the sound from the Meridian room. It wasn't a scream, not at first. It was more of a commotion, the way a crowd shifts when something unexpected happens in the middle of it. That rising hum of noise when 100 small conversations stop at the same moment and replace themselves with one collective reaction. Then someone screamed. Tom and I looked at each other. I said, "Stay here," and I went through the service door. Dennis Farrow was standing in the middle of the Meridian room. He had risen from his corner table. He was standing, which sounds unremarkable, but the way he was standing was wrong. He was upright, but not quite balanced, like a man trying to maintain a stance through something that was fighting him. His hands were at his sides. His head was down, and then it came up slowly, and I could see from across the room that his face was wrong. I can't tell you exactly what I mean by wrong in a way that makes anatomical sense. It was a loss of the thing that makes a face a face. The expression, the movement, the constant micro-adjustments that faces make to respond to the world around them. His eyes were open, but the focus was gone. His mouth was slightly open. He was breathing. I could see that from the movement of his chest, but it was slow. Too slow for someone who was standing, and too regular, like a machine breathing. Donna was 3 feet away from him. She had gotten there in time because she'd been watching, just like I'd asked. She was standing with her hands slightly out, not quite reaching for him but ready to, talking to him in the voice she used for patience. Low, even, no panic in it. She said, "Dennis, Dennis, can you hear me?" He turned his head toward her sound. It was a slow turn. His neck moved like it had been stiffened. Donna said, very quietly, keeping her eyes on him, "He's changing, quickly." There was distance between them. I was moving across the room. Around us, the 40 other people had pulled back. Some of them were by the walls, Some of them were grouped at the far side of the room, away from Dennis. Paulette Delaney had her hand over her mouth. Frank Delaney was standing up from the bar and had knocked his glass over and hadn't noticed. Bobby Nix, 22 years old, had gotten between some of the older guests and the open space, arms slightly out, instinct taking over, before his brain had even processed what was happening. Carla was at the main doors, which were still the only functional exit. She had them open and she was in the doorway, and I could see on her face the arithmetic she was doing. How fast could 40 people get through one set of doors, in what order, in what time, before Dennis got across the room? I reached Donna. I touched her arm and got in front of her. Dennis's head tracked toward me. He made a sound, not a word, not anything with language in it, just a sound from low in his throat, wet and without intention. I said, "Dennis." Nothing. "Dennis. It's Ray. It's Ray Callahan." His head moved toward my voice, the way a plant moves toward light. Pure response. No recognition. Pure. I said, "Donna, get to Carla. Start moving people." She said, "Ray." I said, "Donna," in the tone that means I'm not asking. She went. She went fast, which is a thing I love about her, that she doesn't waste time arguing when there isn't time. Dennis took a step toward me, still slow but purposeful. His mouth opened wider, and that sound again, lower this time, longer. I backed up. He followed. I was keeping his attention on me, and his back to the doors, and I was buying Donna 40 seconds to get to Carla, and for them to start funneling people out. It was not a complicated plan. It was based on the simple observation that Dennis, whatever he was now, was following sound and movement, and he was doing it slowly enough that if I kept moving backward and he kept following, I could keep him away from the cluster of people who were trying not to panic at the far end of the room. Bobby Nix appeared at my elbow. I said, "Bobby, I told you to." He said, "I'm not going without you, Chief." I said, "Bobby." Dennis lunged. It was faster than the walking. Not a run, not remotely athletic, but a sudden forward lean and lurch that covered 6 feet in about 2 seconds, and he was reaching with both hands, and his mouth was wide open. I got my right arm up and I stepped sideways, and he caught the sleeve of my jacket, and I pulled back, and the sleeve tore. He came past me and Bobby, God bless him, grabbed a heavy decorative table centerpiece, one of those big glass vases with flowers, must have weighed 7 pounds, and shoved it into Dennis's path, and Dennis hit it with his shins and went down to one knee. Bobby grabbed my arm and said, "Now," and we ran. We were the last two through the main doors. Donna and Carla had gotten everyone else out. Well, almost everyone. I'll come back to that. They had gotten people into the corridor. Carla pulled the main doors closed behind us and looped the chain from the outside handles and clicked the lock, and from inside, we heard Dennis hitting the doors. 40 people in a 4th-floor corridor. Donna next to me, Bobby Nix breathing hard on my left, Trish Keller, with her hand against the wall, looking like she might faint. Gretchen Oakes, calm as stone, already looking down the corridor toward the elevator bank. Walt Pruitt, flowers still on his apron somehow, arms crossed, jaw set. 40 people. I said, "I need everyone to listen," and they went quiet. Not all of them immediately, but in about 4 seconds they were quiet. Maybe it was the 30 years of security voice. I don't know what it sounds like from the outside, only what it feels like to use. My name is Ray Callahan. I've managed security in this building for 30 years. What just happened with Dennis Farrow is part of a larger event that is happening outside in the city right now. I don't have complete information. I have partial information. What I know is this. The city has issued a shelter-in-place advisory. There is significant civil disruption in the streets outside, and we are safer in this building than we would be trying to leave. So we are not going to try to leave right now. We are going to reorganize, find out what resources we have, and figure out our options in a calm and methodical way. Somebody at the back of the group, I didn't see who, said, "The doors are locked." I said, "Yes, we're working on that. For now, the corridor is safe, and I need everyone to move away from the meridian room doors and toward the stairwell at the north end. Walk, don't run. Roger Vidal, the accountant, said. Shouldn't we call? I said. We're making calls. Mike Stanton is on communications. Keep moving. They moved. Not perfectly. Frank Delaney was drunk and frightened, and those two things were not working well together, and he kept trying to get to the elevators, and Donna kept redirecting him, gently, the way she handled difficult patients. Some of the older guests were shaky. Paulette Delaney, who was Donna's friend, was crying quietly, but moving. The two junior kitchen staff, Becca and Skinny Pete, were holding each other's arms and moving fast. 39 people into the north stairwell, standing on the landing, 2 floors worth of steps. 40 with Bobby behind me, 41 with Donna. I stopped. I counted again. 41. I said to Carla, "Who's missing?" She looked around. She was doing the same count I was. She said, "Audrey." Audrey Pierce, 67 years old, former front desk manager, retired 8 years, came back for my party because she'd known me for 22 years. Audrey, who walked with a cane since her hip replacement, who had been sitting in the corner near the west frosted doors for most of the evening. The corner near the west frosted doors was the corner farthest from the main exit. I said, "Did she get out?" Carla said, "I thought." She looked at me. I thought she was in the group. I thought someone had her. I said, "Who was nearest to her when Dennis?" Nobody answered. I said, "Okay," and I turned back toward the corridor. Donna grabbed my arm. She said, "Ray." I said, "Audrey's in there with him." She said, "And if you go back in there, he'll..." I said, "I know. I need something to put between him and me." Tom Garrity, with his keyring, on the stairwell landing. He said, "The fire extinguisher in the corridor, full, CO2. I said, "Get it. Come with me." Donna looked at me. She said, "You come back." I said, "I know." She let go of my arm. CO2 fire extinguishers, if you've never used one, are heavy, cold, and make a significant amount of noise when discharged. They don't harm anything, no residue, no damage, but they release compressed gas at a temperature of about -70 degrees Fahrenheit, and with a sound that is very loud in an enclosed space. I had dealt with one minor situation in my security career where I had used a CO2 extinguisher as a crowd control tool, in a different context, and I knew what they could do. Tom handed it to me. I had him stay in the corridor. I unhooked the chain on the main doors, just enough to pull one open, slipped inside, and let it ease shut behind me. The meridian room was darker than I expected. The main lights were still on, but Dennis had knocked over a floor lamp and several tables, and the overturned buffet table, he'd hit that too, had created a mess of food and cloth and broken glass in the center of the room that the light bounced off in strange ways. I could see the balloons, still there, the blue and gold ones. The Congratulations Chief banner. Dennis was at the far corner, near where Audrey had been sitting. Audrey was in her chair. She was alive. I could see her chest moving, see her gripping the arms of the chair, and she was absolutely still in the way that prey animals go still. She was a smart woman. She had figured out, with no one explaining it to her, that motion was the thing that drew him. He was about 4 feet from her. He hadn't reached her. He was standing with his head turned, listening, because I had made noise coming in. I said, loudly, "Hey!" He turned toward me. I moved along the wall. He followed, slow. That same lurching step. I kept the extinguisher at my hip. I needed to time this right. I needed him close enough that the CO2 discharge would disorient him without being so close that he could grab me before I got it up. Audrey, bless her, understood what I was doing. I could see her starting to move, slow and careful, toward the doors, using her cane, placing it without sound. Dennis was 10 feet from me. I moved and he followed. He made the low sound again. 8 feet. 6. He lunged again, faster this time than before, or maybe I was more tired and had less reaction time. because he got his hands on my shoulders before I got the extinguisher up, and his grip was strong in a way that surprised me. Not powerful, but locked, like something had seized in his hands. I got the extinguisher between us and discharged it directly into his face and chest. The sound in the room was enormous. The cloud of CO2 gas, white and cold, hit him full in the face, and he made a different sound. Not pain, exactly, but a recoil, a sudden pulling back, like an involuntary full-body flinch. His grip broke. He went sideways 2 steps and hit a table. I grabbed Audrey's arm. She grabbed her cane. We went. Tom had the door from outside. It was open before I reached it. We got through, and Tom got it closed, and I stood with my back against the wall in the corridor and breathed. Audrey Pierce put her hand on my arm and said, "Thank you, Ray." I said, "You're welcome, Audrey." She said, "I thought it was best not to move." I said, "That was the right call." She said, "Is there going to be food?" I hadn't finished my plate. I looked at her, 67 years old, hip replacement. Just spent however many minutes locked in a dark room with a thing that used to be Dennis Farrow, asking me about the buffet. I said, "We'll find something." She said, "Good. I'm still hungry." I decided at that moment that Audrey Pierce was going to be fine. We reconvened in the north stairwell. 42 people, all present. The main doors to the Meridian room were chained on the outside, and I was fairly confident that whatever Dennis had become could not operate the chain. And I was right, though it took another 40 minutes of listening to confirm that, the irregular thumping of him at the doors eventually settling into a pattern that matched a body throwing itself at a surface without any understanding of how the surface worked. That was an important thing to know. I filed it away. I stood on the landing and told them everything. I want to say this took a long time. It didn't. I told them in about 4 minutes. The shelter-in-place advisory, the situation in the streets, Dennis's exposure and change, the locked doors and why they had been locked, and who had locked them. When I got to Patrick's name, there was a reaction. People turning toward Patrick, who had come down from his office, because I'd called him on his radio and told him to be present, because the worst thing in a crisis is for someone to be absent while the story of their decision is being told. He stood at the edge of the group and took the reaction, which included some angry voices. A young woman whose name I didn't have yet, one of the hotel's reception staff who'd been at the party, saying, "He locked us in with," and someone else saying something I didn't catch. I said, "Stop," louder than usual. They stopped. Patrick made a decision based on information he had, following instructions from a federal health agency. His reasoning was, if Dennis left the building in the state he was in, and if what's happening to Dennis is what's happening to the people we've seen outside on the cameras, then Dennis leaving could have made the situation outside significantly worse. You can disagree with that reasoning. We have time to disagree with it later. Right now, I need him, and I need his expertise, and I need everyone to set aside the question of blame until we have time for it. The angry voices didn't go away entirely, but they went quiet. Then Trish Keller said, "We should be trying to call for help." I said, "Mike has been calling. What's the status, Mike?" Mike said, 911 is either busy or not answering. I got through to a general operator at the city emergency line who told me to stay in place and wait. Hotel's main line is still working for internal calls. Cell service is patchy. Trish said, "What about the hotel's emergency protocols?" I said, "Trish, I wrote the hotel's emergency protocols. I know what they say. They weren't written for this." She opened her mouth, closed it. I said, "Here's what we're doing. First, we're not trying to go outside right now. The street situation makes that dangerous. Second, we're moving to secure locations in the building. We have the kitchen, which has food and water. We have the maintenance areas, which have tools and supplies. We have Patrick's office, which has the camera system. We're going to use all of that. Third, I need people to sort themselves. Anyone with a medical background, you're with Donna. Anyone with building knowledge or maintenance experience, you're with Tom Garrity. Anyone who's physically able and willing to help with security, you're with Carla and Mike. Everyone else, you stay in the group and follow instructions. Bobby Nix said, "What about me?" I said, "You're with me, Bobby." He nodded once and looked very relieved to have been told where to stand. The reorganization took about 15 minutes. Donna got 4 people in her group, a hotel events coordinator named Barbara, who'd taken a first aid course, 2 of the party guests who happened to have nursing or medical backgrounds I didn't know about until Donna asked, and Lena Doyle, the server, who'd mentioned she'd been an EMT for 2 years before switching to hospitality. The medical group was actually pretty strong. Tom Garrity got himself and 2 of the younger maintenance-oriented staff. Carla and Mike got 6 people who ranged from genuinely useful, an ex-military man in his 50s named Gary Sherwood, who I'd never met before, a friend of one of the kitchen staff, to theoretically helpful. And the remaining core group? Trish, liability; Frank Delaney, drunk, liability; Paulette Delaney, anxious but competent; Roger Vidal, calm, organized; Audrey Pierce, injured hip but completely unafraid, somehow; Walt Pruitt, chef, enormous value; and a handful of others. 42 people. 1 building, an unknown situation outside. This was 9:30 p.m. on a Friday, April 19th. I have to pause on that for a second, even now. April 19th. I had been planning to be on a plane to Lisbon in 13 days. The kitchen run happened at 10 p.m. I say run. It was more of a careful, organized relocation. The kitchen was on the 4th floor, connected to the Meridian Room by the service corridor. The service corridor was the one route we had through the 4th floor that didn't require going out into the main corridor near the Meridian Room doors. And the kitchen was, obviously, enormously important. Walt had catered a full buffet for 42 people, plus extras, but most of it had been on the overturned buffet table inside the Meridian Room. What was left in the kitchen was the raw and prep stock, which was actually more valuable. I went in with Tom, Walt, Bobby, and Gary Sherwood. Donna stayed with the group in the north stairwell. Carla held the stairwell door and kept eyes on the main corridor. The service corridor was clear. We made it to the kitchen. Walt went straight for his walk-in and started itemizing. Walt was crying a little bit when he came back out. Not dramatically. He wiped his face with his forearm and kept his expression steady. But his eyes were red, and he said, in a slightly tight voice, 2 full walk-ins. I over-ordered for the party. I always over-order. He gave a short laugh that wasn't quite a laugh. 80-90 people worth of supplies. Dry goods extra. I said, tell me specifically. He took a breath. He said, protein. I've got 40 pounds of chicken, 15 pounds of beef roast, 12 pounds of salmon, a lot of deli cold cuts, maybe 20 pounds. Dairy, large quantities, but dairy is perishable, so we use that first while the refrigeration's running. Dry, 50-pound bag of rice, pasta, 20 pounds of flour, cooking oil, canned goods, 6 cases of various, tomatoes, beans, corn, mixed vegetables, bread, 6 loaves fresh baked today, 3 dozen rolls I made for the party that didn't get out of the kitchen, fresh produce, significant, also perishable. I said, estimate, total calories. How long can you feed 40 people? He said, without hesitating, because Walt was a professional, and professionals think in portions and yield, and he had done this math for events his whole career. 3 solid meals a day for 40 people? If we're generous, 2 weeks. If we ration, 2 meals a day, normal portions, 3 weeks. If we're austere about it, 4 meals a day between 40 people, small portions, we could stretch to a month. I said, plan for rationing. 2 meals a day until we know more. He said, my walk-in is on this building's power grid. When power fails, I said, we'll deal with it. Whatever's in there, we eat first, once power starts being unreliable. He nodded. Chef mode, problem-solving mode. Tom and Gary and Bobby were going through the rest of the kitchen. The walk-in freezer, separate from the refrigerator, had more frozen meat, primarily, longer term. The dry storage room was generous. There was a water line to the kitchen that was still running from the building's main supply, which was connected to the city's pressure system. This was one of the things I'd asked Tom about immediately. Tom said the hotel's water pressure was fed by the city mains, and as long as those stayed pressurized, we had water. If pressure failed, there was a rooftop storage tank that could supply the building by gravity for a certain period. He wasn't sure exactly how long. I said, "Calculate it." He was already on it. Beyond the kitchen supplies, cleaning supplies in the service room, which included bleach, ammonia, which we couldn't mix but could use separately, and various disinfectants, fire extinguishers in their wall mounts throughout the corridors, a maintenance cart in the service room that had basic tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, a utility knife, zip ties, electrical tape, a small bolt cutter that Tom used when he needed to cut padlocks off mechanical room doors, and that I immediately claimed for myself, 2 rolls of duct tape, a hand truck, an assortment of rags and mops. Not an armory, but more than nothing. I also had 42 people who were alive and mostly functional, a building I knew better than my own apartment, a camera system covering the exterior, and whatever the city situation would give us as it developed. We moved as much of the usable kitchen supply as possible into the corridor, into the stairwell, enough for the next 24 hours, calculated by Walt, portioned and organized, and then we blockaded the kitchen access with a pair of the heavy prep tables pushed against the service door, just enough that anything that came through that corridor would have to push through it. It was 11:30 p.m. when we finished. The party had started 4.5 hours ago. The next few hours were when I started to really understand how different people come apart under pressure, or don't. Donna had organized the north stairwell into something functional. The lower landing was the medical area, first aid kit from Tom's maintenance supply, and 2 from the kitchen. Every commercial kitchen is required to have certified kits, and whatever people had in their bags and pockets. Upper landing was the sleeping area. Bobby had gone to the housekeeping storage closet on the 4th floor, which Gretchen had known about because Gretchen knows every closet, and retrieved a stack of blankets that were kept there for linen cart restocking. Not ideal. Itchy. Hotel standard blankets. But blankets. People sorted themselves into the sleeping area in whatever arrangement felt most tolerable. Gary Sherwood sat at the stairwell door and said he'd take first watch without anyone asking him to, and I did not argue. Frank Delaney had passed the worst of the drunk by about midnight and gone very quiet and sat with Paulette and held her hand, which I thought was better for everyone. Trish Keller had her phone out constantly, sending messages to various numbers, most of which weren't going through. I understood the impulse. I had sent a message to Claire, my daughter, at the very start, before everything went sideways, and I'd gotten back a read receipt and no reply. Later, after the doors were locked, I'd sent another. At the hotel, situation developing. Shelter in place. Do not try to reach us. I love you. Tell Paul. We are okay. That one had gone out with a single tick. Sent, but not confirmed delivered. I had no idea if she'd gotten it. I sat with that for about 10 minutes. Just sat with it. And then I put my phone in my pocket and went back to work because there was too much work to do, and sitting with it wasn't going to change the tick. Patrick Holt came down at midnight. He'd been in his office continuously since I'd left him there, watching cameras. He found me in the corridor and said he needed to show me something. We went up to his office. The camera feeds had changed. The area immediately outside the hotel, the front street, the alley, the parking garage entrance, had significantly more of them than it had 2 hours ago. Dozens, not a mob, not one mass of them, but scattered groups, drawn by whatever sounds were happening on the street, other people moving, other confrontations, things I couldn't identify on the camera. They tended to gather where there was noise and movement, and then sort of linger when the noise stopped. Patrick said, "Watch the front entrance." The front entrance had 2 of them pressed against the glass. They were pressing because something inside the lobby, the lights probably, visible from outside, was giving them something to move toward. They weren't getting in. The glass was heavy, reinforced, the kind hotels use on their main frontage because drunk people lean on it. But they were pressing steadily. Patrick said, "There are 2 more at the East Alley exit, one at the service door. I said. Building is sealed? He said, from outside, the locks are on, the doors are secure. But Chief, he pointed to one of the feeds. Lobby. The lobby camera showed the front desk, the elevator bank, the seating area. It also showed one of the glass external doors, which had started to bow inward. Not broken yet, but stressed. He said, that glass has a rated impact threshold. I looked it up. He showed me a browser tab he'd opened, the manufacturer's spec sheet for the hotel's exterior glazing. I don't know what sustained pressure does to it over time versus impact. The spec only covers impact. I said, when did they start pressing? He said, about 45 minutes ago. I said, get me Tom. Tom Garrity's assessment of the lobby glass was less reassuring than the spec sheet. He said the glass was designed for single high-force impacts, not prolonged sustained pressure. He said if the number pressing against it stayed the same or grew, the silicone seal on the frame would fail before the glass broke, probably, and once the seal failed, the whole panel could shift. He said he had seen it happen once when a delivery truck backed into the lobby entrance very slowly. I said, what can we put against it? He said, from inside, the lobby furniture is heavy. The front desk itself is bolted down, but the seating couches and chairs, big, heavy, upholstered. If we push them against the glass panels, it would give the glass something to lean into, spread the load. I said, who goes? Carla said, me and Mike and Gary. I said, and Bobby. Bobby said, obviously. I looked at Donna. She was at the top of the stairs, listening. She said, go. I've got things here. We went through the service corridor to the stairwell, down to the lobby. The lobby was dim, just the emergency lighting, the overhead main lights having gone to low power at midnight on the hotel's automatic timer. The light through the front glass was the ambient glow of a city that was partially on fire somewhere, an orange tint to the sky that shouldn't have been there. There were 5 of them against the front glass now. You could hear them when we reached the bottom of the stairs. A low ambient sound, not quite moaning, not quite breathing, just constant. A sound like bad weather pressing against the building. And the glass was bowed. I could see the bend from 20 feet away, a slight concavity to the panel that had not been there when I walked through that lobby at 6 p.m. Carla said quietly, there are more of them. Outside, beyond the 5 at the glass, there were more on the street. 15, 20, not pressing, just being there, circling without purpose. Some were grouped around something we couldn't see further up the block. One was standing in the center of the road doing nothing at all. I said, don't make noise. Move the furniture. We moved the lobby couches, 4 of them. Heavy, deep, hotel-quality couches, the kind that cost a small fortune and are designed to survive 15 years of traveling public. To the front glass, and pushed them up against it. Then chairs, a coffee table. We arranged them against the panels in a kind of interlocked stack that would give the glass something solid to lean into. It was quiet work, and we were quiet doing it. The things outside didn't seem to respond to our movement inside, which was something I kept note of. They responded to sound. They responded to sudden light changes. They didn't seem to respond to movement they couldn't hear. We were 40 minutes in the lobby. We got back to the stairwell without incident. That was the first night. I'm going to call it what it was. Not that bad. Frightening, yes. Uncertain, yes. But not catastrophic. We were 42 people, sheltered, with food and water and light and heat, in a building that was structurally secure. The situation outside was serious, but serious situations outside don't automatically become serious situations inside if the inside is well managed. I had done difficult nights in that building before. Not this kind of difficult, but difficult. I went to the stairwell at 2 in the morning, sat down on the landing next to Donna, and ate half a bread roll. She said, you should sleep. I said, Gary's on watch. I'll take over at 4. She said, Ray, sit still for 5 minutes. I sat still. The stairwell smelled like people and a little like the cleaning supplies we'd brought in, and faintly like the food from the kitchen run, and from somewhere far above came the sound of the building settling, its pipes, its airflow, the particular voice of old architecture at night. I knew that sound so well I could tell you which floor it was coming from. This was the 4th floor, the water pressure cycling through the overnight rest mode. I said, "The cake is still in the meridian room." Donna said, "The cake?" I said, "Walt's 3-tier cake. On the buffet counter. It was the last thing I saw before all this." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I ordered a smaller backup cake from Brennan's and left it at home in the refrigerator." I looked at her. She said, "In case the big one got damaged in transport." I said, "You have a backup cake." She said, "I always have a backup." I laughed. It was a real laugh, a genuine one, and it felt strange in the stairwell at 2 in the morning on the first night of the end of the world, but it was real. She leaned against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. We sat like that until 4 a.m. when I took over from Gary. Saturday, April 20th. 1 day in. I want to tell you about the sabotage now, because it started on day 2, and I need you to understand what it felt like from the inside. Because from the inside, it started as a series of inexplicable things that were individually small enough to dismiss, and collectively were going to kill us. The first thing happened at 8 in the morning. Tom Garrity had done a check of the building's power systems and had come back to tell me the hotel was running normally on grid power, which was reassuring. It meant the city's grid was still up, at least in our area. The hotel had a backup generator, a large one, diesel-powered, capable of running the building's essential systems for about 4 to 5 days on the fuel we had on hand. Tom had tested it that morning, and it had started and run for 3 minutes, and then stopped. He came and found me in the stairwell and said, "The generator test failed." I said, "What happened?" He said, "It ran, then it cut out. The engine diagnostic shows a fuel line block, which..." I checked the fuel line. "It's clear. There's no block." I said, "Could it be a sensor error?" He said, "Could be. But Chief, the fuel level indicator also shows the tank is at 42%. I had topped the tank last week, and it was at 96%. I sat with that. 42%. Half the diesel fuel missing. I said, "Where does it go? Is there a drain?" He said, "There's an overflow drain, yes. For safety, in case of overfill. But the overflow valve is manual, and it was closed. I closed it myself last week when I topped the tank." I said, "And now?" He said, "Open." Someone had opened the generator overflow drain. It was in the basement mechanical room, which was accessible only through the service stairwell, and only with a key. Tom had a key. The maintenance staff had copies. The hotel's master key could also open it in an emergency, but the master key was in the security office on the 2nd floor. I asked Tom who else had been in the basement since last night. He said, "Just me, when I tested the generator this morning. Before that, me yesterday afternoon, routine check." I said, "No one else?" He said, "That I know of." I went to the security office on the 2nd floor. Carla was there. I told her about the generator drain. She said, "Someone went into the basement and opened it deliberately." I said, "Yes." She said, "How much fuel do we have?" I said, "Enough for maybe 2 days, if power stays on, and we run the generator as backup. Less if we need to run it continuously." She said, "Someone is sabotaging us." I said, "I know. And here is the thing about that. The thing that made it worse was that I had 42 people in this building, and I did not know which one of them had done it. And the list of people with either the access or the knowledge to do it was not short. Tom and his team, the maintenance staff, anyone who knew the building well, anyone who'd found their way to the master key, and Patrick Holt, who had full systems access, who had already demonstrated he would act without consulting me. I'm going to say something that I have told very few people since. I suspected Patrick. I thought it was Patrick. Not because I thought he was malicious, but because the logic seemed to fit. He had made one unilateral security decision already. He had knowledge of the building systems. He had a key card that could take him most places. Maybe he was trying to keep us in place longer, keep us from having power enough to escape. waiting for the government response that Agent Whitfield had promised. I was wrong. I was wrong in the specific way that security thinking can get you into trouble, which is that you start from the most logical suspect and you stop looking. The person doing the sabotage was not Patrick. I'll tell you who it was, but not yet. What I did at that point was tell Carla and Tom, and nobody else. I asked Tom to conduct a quiet inventory of every locked access point in the building and who had been seen near them. I asked Carla to do a subtle, non-alarming check of where people had been in the night and who had been out of the sleeping area for extended periods. I kept this between the three of us, plus Mike, because I could not afford the group splitting into suspicion and accusation while we still had so many other pressing things to manage. The second act of sabotage came at noon. Patrick had been running the cameras and giving me regular reports. At noon, he called me on the radio and said the east emergency exit camera had gone offline. I went up to his office. The camera was dark. Not the image was dark. The image was gone. Black screen, feed lost. Patrick said, "Either the camera failed or it's been covered." I said, "From inside or outside?" He said, "The camera is in the service corridor, facing the east emergency exit door. It's internal." Internal. Someone had covered or disabled an internal camera. I said, "Can you bring it back?" He said, "If it's been physically covered, I can't. If it's a technical issue, I can try to reboot the feed." He tried. The screen stayed black. I said, "That's the east exit, the one that's chained." He said, "Yes." "If someone," I said, "How would someone get the chain off without us hearing it?" He said, "The chain is a bicycle lock chain, right? Standard loop. If someone had bolt cutters." I said, "The bolt cutters are..." I stopped. The bolt cutters. I had taken Tom's bolt cutters from the maintenance cart on the first night and put them in the security office for safekeeping. I went to the security office at a pace that was not quite running. The security office was locked, as I'd left it. I unlocked it. I went to the shelf where I'd put the bolt cutters. They were still there. So not the bolt cutters. I put them back and locked the door again, and stood in the corridor thinking, because the east exit had a chain, and the chain had a lock, and without bolt cutters you couldn't, unless you had the key to the lock. The chain lock key was on my key ring. I checked my key ring. All keys present. I went to the east exit corridor. The chain was on the doors. I checked it. Still locked, but the camera was still dark. So someone had covered the camera, but had not opened the door. Yet, I taped a note on the inside of the east exit door, just a folded piece of paper, nothing that would look like a trap, that said, "Checked, Saturday noon, RC," and I checked it every 3 hours for the rest of the day. The note was still there each time. Whatever they were planning, they hadn't done it yet. Saturday afternoon was the hardest part of that day, not because anything dramatic happened. It didn't. It was actually relatively quiet, and the quiet was its own kind of hard. 42 people in a stairwell in a set of corridors, with minimal information about what was happening outside, with the city visible from the windows as a place that was clearly in severe distress, but that you couldn't reach. I had people checking their phones constantly, sending messages to family, getting back silence or error messages, or the occasional single word that was worse than silence, because it raised more questions than it answered. A woman named Diane, I'm going to be honest. Diane worked in the hotel's events department, and I knew her face and her first name and nothing else. She got a call at around 2 in the afternoon. A real call, not a message, an actual voice call that went through. She answered it in the corner of the upper landing, and we could all see from the way her face changed in the first 5 seconds that the news from the other end was not good. She didn't break down. She went very still, and then she said something we couldn't hear, and then she said, "Okay," and hung up. And then she sat against the wall and looked at the floor for a long time. Donna went and sat with her. No big conversation, just sat there. That was what was needed. Tom came to me at 3:30. He said, "I have the water numbers." The rooftop storage tank held 12,000 gallons. The hotel, running normally, used approximately 4,000 gallons a day for all functions. running with 42 people and no guest rooms, no pool service, minimal laundry. He estimated we could cut consumption to maybe 800 gallons a day if we were disciplined. The city mains were still pressurized. Tom had tested by checking the water pressure on a fourth-floor tap. If the mains held, we had continuous supply. If the mains failed, and we had to use only the tank, 15 days at extreme conservation. I said, double-check the tank access. He said, I was just about to. He went up to the roof access stairwell. He was back in 15 minutes, with an expression that I read immediately. I said, what happened? He said, the roof access door was unlocked. I said, it's supposed to be. He said, locked, yes. It was unlocked, not forced, opened with a key. Chief, someone has been on the roof. I went up with him. The roof access stairwell ran from the top of the north stairwell up 2 additional flights to the rooftop service door. It should have been locked with the standard building key. The door was unlocked, the lock mechanism intact, no damage, just unlocked. The rooftop, 12 stories above street level, large mechanical area, evac units, the rooftop water tank, communication relay boxes, some old satellite dish hardware that we'd stopped using but never removed. And there, at the edge of the roof, looking over the parapet, on the far side near the east wall, Patrick Holt. He heard me and turned. He didn't look guilty. He looked tired. I said, Patrick. He said, I was looking at the building next door. I said, why? He said, because it's the only way out. I looked where he was looking. The adjacent building to the east, separated from the Hartfield Grand by a gap of about 30 feet at roof level, was a parking garage, 7 stories. Open sides at each level, concrete pillars, the kind of structure you can see through. It was quieter than the street, at least from up here, and it was attached, on its far side, to another commercial block that connected further south. The rooftop of the parking garage was 7 floors below the rooftop of the hotel. To get there from here would require either a bridge or a controlled descent of approximately 50 feet. Patrick said, I found a rope in the maintenance supplies, 2 sections, each about 60 feet. We could tie them together. I said, you've been thinking about this. He said, I've been thinking about it since last night. Chief, those people outside are responding to sound. They gather where there's sound. The street outside the hotel has too many of them now, because the hotel has been making sounds. People moving, the glass in the lobby lights. But the parking garage, he pointed. Look, there's nobody in there. Not on any level I can see. And there's a ramp out the far side onto Garrison Street, which goes south. At 4 in the morning if we go across. I said, 130-foot rope over 30 feet of open air at rooftop level. That's what you're proposing. He said, yes. I said, for 42 people, some of them elderly, one of them with a replaced hip. He said, I know, but Chief, I've been watching the lobby cameras. The glass is stressed. I don't think it lasts 2 more days. I looked at the lobby cameras from his phone, which he'd patched into his system remotely. He was right. The front glass was worse. More of them pressed against it now. The couches we'd pushed up against it from inside were holding, but the frame was visibly bent. I said, you unlocked the roof access door. He said, yes. I thought, if we need to move fast. I said, Patrick, I need to know everything. If you think of something, if you do something, you tell me first. Every time. Do you understand? He said, yes. I said, because right now, someone in our group is doing things without authorization, and I don't know who, and every time I find an unexplained change in this building, I have to suspect everyone, including you. So tell me, the generator drain, the camera, were those you? He said, no, immediately, no hesitation. No, I don't. Why would I drain the generator? We need the generator. I believed him. The generator drain was the thing that had been pointing me wrong, because it made no sense even for Patrick's logic. Locking doors makes a kind of sense if you're trying to contain something. Draining a generator that you might need to power the cameras that give you eyes on the situation, that doesn't fit. I said, all right, come with me. We're going to talk about this rope plan. We went back inside and I locked the roof access door and put the key in my jacket pocket. The third act of sabotage was the one that could have killed us. Saturday evening, 8 p.m. Walt had organized the first full day of rationed meals. Lunch had been a bowl each of the fresh soup he'd managed to make on the kitchen's gas range. The gas was still running, separate from the electrical grid, using the vegetable stock and some of the perishable produce that needed to go first. Dinner was a smaller amount of the same, with bread. People ate it without complaint mostly. Frank Delaney made a comment about portion sizes that Donna shut down with a single look before anyone else could respond. I was doing a walk of the fourth-floor corridor when Mike Stanton radioed me. He said, "Chief, the stairwell." I said, "Which stairwell?" He said, "South. There's someone coming up, from below." The south stairwell connected the fourth floor down to the lobby and below. We'd sealed the south stairwell door at the fourth floor with one of the heavy prep tables from the kitchen, pushed up against the inside of the door so it couldn't swing in, as a backup precaution. The idea was that if anything, or anyone, came up from the lobby, the table would slow them down and we'd hear the impact. Mike said, "I can hear it. It's not from the lobby side. It's from the third floor." I said, "The third floor stairwell door, who?" Mike said, "Get here now." I got there. The south stairwell door had the prep table against it. And from the other side I could hear it. A slow, rhythmic pushing. Not the throwing of a body sound that I'd learned to associate with Dennis in the Meridian room. This was different, more controlled, like a person pushing against a door. I said, "Mike, how did something get to the third floor?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Has the third floor stairwell been accessed?" He said, "It shouldn't have been. The south stairwell door at the third floor was locked." Was locked. I said to Gary Sherwood, who was behind me, "Keep people back." I went through the interior corridor to the north stairwell and down one floor to the third floor. The north stairwell landed on the third floor at a door. I pressed my ear to it. Quiet. I opened it a crack. The third floor main corridor. Dark. No overhead lights. Just the exit signs and a gray residual glow from the end windows. I could see from the crack of the door that the corridor was empty. I opened the door further and came through. The south stairwell entrance on the third floor was at the far end of the corridor. I could see it from here. The stairwell door was open, propped open. Not pushed open, propped. Something had been wedged under the door to hold it open. I walked toward it carefully. Halfway down the corridor I stepped on something and looked down. A key. A single hotel key, the standard physical key type, not a key card. I picked it up. It was the third floor south stairwell key. It said so on the tag. Someone had unlocked the south stairwell, propped the door open, and allowed whatever was in the stairwell access to the third floor, where the stairwell connected to the lobby. I went back to the stairwell opening and looked down. In the dim emergency lighting of the stairwell below, on the second floor landing, there were two of them. Two infected, in the stairwell, moving toward the sound of my breathing. I backed up. I pulled the door almost shut. I needed something to lock it again. The key I'd found unlocked it, which meant it locked it too. I got the key into the lock, turned it, heard the click. The door was locked again. But the two in the stairwell were already on the third floor landing, pressing against the far side of the door. I went back to the north stairwell, back up to 4. I stood at the top and said, to everyone in earshot, as clearly as I could, "Someone has opened an access point. There are 2 infected on the third floor. The door is locked again. The immediate threat is contained. But we now have a problem in the building that we didn't have an hour ago, and I need to know who did this." Nobody said anything. I said, "I'm not asking for a confession right now. I'm saying, whoever did this, you need to come to me and explain why before we have any more of these incidents, because the next one may not be something I can reverse." Silence. Then Audrey Pierce said, from her blanket on the upper landing, "Ray, check the group." I said, "What?" She said, "Count us." I looked around. I started counting. 42 people, minus myself. 41 to count. I counted 39. I said, Who's missing? Nobody moved for a second, and then people started looking around, doing their own checks, and then someone said, "Where's Roger?" Roger Vidal, the accountant, calm, organized, had been helpful in the reorganization, who had been sitting quietly all day, and whom I had registered as fine and non-problematic, and had therefore not been watching. I said, "Has anyone seen Roger in the last hour?" Paulette Delaney said, "He went to use the bathroom." "The one in the service corridor. That was maybe 45 minutes ago." 45 minutes in the bathroom was a long time. I should have noticed. I had been focused on the sabotage and the roof and Patrick, and had not been watching the quiet ones. My mistake. I found Roger Vidal in the service corridor on the 4th floor. Not in the bathroom, but in the narrow gap between the supply closet and the evac room, sitting on the floor with his phone, and his knees pulled to his chest, and his face in his hands. He looked up when I found him. His eyes were red. I crouched down. I said, "Roger." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "The stairwell. Was that you?" He said, "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to. I was trying to get out." He had been trying to leave the building. Not to harm anyone, not for any malicious reason. He had found his way to the south stairwell, used the key he'd lifted from the maintenance supply area, opened the door, found the stairwell clear on the upper floors, started going down, reached the 2nd floor landing, and found the two of them already on that landing. He'd dropped the key and run back up and propped the door open as he came through because he didn't have the key anymore. Then he'd hidden in the service corridor because he was terrified of facing me. He said, "My wife. I got a message from my wife. She was trying to. She's at home. She's alone. I have to get." I said, "Where does your wife live?" He said, "Squirrel Hill. It's 20 minutes by car. 20 minutes by car. In this city. In this situation." I said, "Roger, I understand. I hear what you're saying. My daughter is in Toronto, and my brother is in Phoenix, and I have no way to get to either of them either. I understand." He said, "I have to." I said, "I know, but you can't go through that stairwell. Not now." He said, "I was going to walk." 20 minutes. I said gently, "Roger, look at the windows." The service corridor had a small window at the end. Through it, the orange-lit street. From this angle, the west side. You could see maybe 40 of them on a 2-block section of street. He looked. He looked for a long time. I said, "I am working on a way out, a real way out. I need everyone alive to use it when it's ready, including you." He said, "When?" I said, "Soon." He said, "How soon?" I said, "I'm working on it." I said, "I'm working on it." I sat with him in that gap for 10 minutes. Not much was said. He had his phone, and he was looking at the last message from his wife, which was from 2 hours ago, and said, "Still fine at home, PLs respond," and had no answer, because he'd had no signal when it came through. I told him to send something, send anything, because even one bar might get a message out eventually. He typed, "Here, hotel, with people, stay home, lock everything, I love you." It sent with a single tick. He looked at it. He said, "If it goes through." I said, "Then she knows." He nodded. I got him back to the stairwell. I did not announce to the group what he had done, or why. I had Carla quietly deal with the key situation, recovering all spare keys from the maintenance supply, consolidating them, keeping them accounted for. And then, because it was 10 p.m. on Saturday, and I had been awake for 36 hours with a 2-hour nap, and things were getting worse outside, and we had a sabotage situation I hadn't fully solved, and a plan for escape that involved a rope and an open rooftop at 12 stories up, I sat down on a step and allowed myself, for exactly 4 minutes, to be completely and entirely out of ideas. I know it was 4 minutes because I timed it. I have done this before in difficult situations. I give myself a fixed amount of time to not know what to do, and then I make myself stop. At the end of 4 minutes, I had one idea. The idea was, I needed to actually talk to Patrick, not just use him as a camera operator. I needed to know everything he knew about the building's systems, and the situation outside, and I needed to build the escape plan around what was actually possible, not what I was hoping was possible. I went to his office. We talked for 3 hours. Here is what Patrick told me, in the right order. The CDC hotline he had called on the evening of April 19th had been a special emergency operations number, not public. He had found it through the hotel's security alert system, which had included it in the full-text version of the emergency broadcast as a point of contact for commercial property managers. He'd called it. He'd been connected to someone who identified herself as Agent Whitfield of the CDC Emergency Operations Group. She had been informed, somehow, through whatever systems they were using to track the incident, that there was a bite victim at the Hartfield Grand Hotel on 4th Avenue. She had told Patrick that this person needed to be contained, that the infection was spreading through direct contact with infected individuals, and that the protocol for buildings with confirmed infected individuals was to prevent egress until response teams arrived. She had also told him that the infection was fast. She said 30 minutes to 6 hours from bite to full change. She said the range was variable based on things she didn't explain. She said not to approach the infected individual, not to allow him to leave, and to report back to that line every 30 minutes. I said, and you stopped being able to reach the line. He said, at 7:30, about 45 minutes after I first called. After that, nothing. Dead line. I said, what else did she say about the infection? He said, she said, and this is the part that's been going through my head since. She said, do not allow any bitten individuals to come into contact with your general population. She said it twice. I sat with that. I said, she knew about the infection spreading. The way it spreads. He said, she knew before it was on any news channel, before any public announcement. They knew. I said, which means they had seen this before, or something like it. He said, or they had advance information. I don't know how. I just know that what she described on that call, the progression, the behavior of the infected, the way they respond to sound, she described all of it, in about 4 minutes, like she was reading from a protocol. A protocol that already existed. That is not a small thing. A protocol means preparation. Preparation means either foreknowledge or prior experience. I did not know which it was, and I still don't, not really. But it sat in the back of everything I did from that point forward, like a stone in a shoe. Present, unavoidable, not yet the thing that stopped me. I said, the building next door, the parking garage, what do you know about it? He pulled up a city property record he'd already found. He'd been busy, Patrick. He'd been very busy, and very quiet about it. The parking garage was owned by a commercial property company, built in 2009. 7 stories, open air each level, connected at street level to a through street on the south side that ran to the Grandview district, connected at the 4th level via a covered walkway, which I did not know about, to the adjacent commercial building, a former department store now used as office space. A covered walkway, not a rope. A covered walkway, if it was still accessible. I said, where is the walkway access? From the garage side or the office building side? He said, both sides have doors. The office building side is sealed. I found the property company's code in their maintenance system. He looked slightly embarrassed about how he'd found this. I was in their network remotely, looking for anything useful. I said, I'm going to pretend you said you found it in a public database. What's the code? He told me. I said, walkway at the 4th level, if we can get from the hotel rooftop to the parking garage. He said, 20 feet of air gap at rooftop level. The garage roof is lower, like I said, but the 4th floor of the garage, he pointed on the property diagram, is approximately level with the 5th floor of the hotel. The hotel's 5th floor has a window at the end of the east corridor that I think is roughly the right height. I said, the east window, that's not far from the east emergency exit. He said, yes. I said, what's the gap between the hotel's 5th floor east corridor window and the parking garage 4th level? He said, I'd have to measure, but I think maybe 10 feet, 12 at most, horizontally. 10 feet. 10 to 12 feet of open air between the 5th floor of the hotel and the 4th level of an open-air parking garage, at height, over concrete below. Not a fun gap. But not a 30-foot rooftop gap either. I said, "What's between the windows and the garage?" "The alley." He said, "The alley is 20 feet wide at street level. At height, the buildings are closer, because the hotel and the garage both have slight overhangs. My guess, maybe 12 feet." I said, "We need to measure it. Tomorrow morning, early, with a tape. Can you get to the 5th floor east window without waking everyone?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Do it. And Patrick, about the rope. Do you still have it?" He said, "In the maintenance room. 2 60-foot sections." I said, "Don't use it. Not for crossing. Too much risk for the older guests. But keep it, because I have another use for it." He said, "What use?" I said, "Lowering supplies. If we get across to the garage, I don't want to carry everything. We lower what we can on the rope, make it easier for people to move. We can carry less, move faster." He said, Yeah, that works." I said, "Good." I looked at the cameras one more time. The lobby glass was alarming. The lobby glass was the clock we were running against. I estimated, based on Tom's assessment and what I was seeing, 24 hours, maybe 36, before that glass failed, which meant we needed to be out before then. "Patrick," I said, "sleep a few hours. I need you functioning tomorrow." He said, "What about the cameras?" I said, "Set them to record. I'll watch for 2 hours and then wake you." He said, "Chief, He stopped. He looked at the desk. "I'm sorry. About the doors. I know it's..." I said, "I meant what I said before. I don't know if it was right or wrong. I don't know that we'd have been safer if everyone had left at 7:45 before Dennis changed. I don't know what those streets were like at 7:45. Maybe you kept 40 people alive by locking those doors." He said, "Maybe." I said, "Yeah, maybe." I watched the cameras while he slept in his chair. I watched the street outside, where there were now too many of them to count easily, moving in their purposeless way, clustering at noise and dispersing when it faded. I watched the lobby glass. I watched the East Alley. At 3 a.m., the East Alley camera, which had been dark since noon, suddenly came back on. I sat up. The camera was live again. Whoever had covered it had apparently uncovered it while I was watching, which was either a mistake or a deliberate choice. I watched the East Alley for a long time. Nothing moved. The alley was empty. I made a note on Patrick's pad. Cam E restored 0307. No activity. Unknown cause. And then I watched the lobby camera again and thought about a 10-foot gap at height and a parking garage at 4 in the morning when the streets were quietest. Sunday, April 21st, day 3. Tom and Patrick measured the gap at 7 in the morning. I had them both take separate measurements independently, using the rolled measuring tape from Tom's maintenance kit, lowering it out the 5th floor east corridor window on a string, and comparing their reads. Tom said 12 feet. Patrick said 11. Compromise. Call it 12. 12 feet of open air. The parking garage 4th level floor was slightly below the 5th floor windowsill, so you'd be stepping slightly down onto the garage side. The concrete pillar of the garage was across from the window, providing a handhold on the far side if you could reach it. I said, "We need a bridge. Not a rope bridge, not 12 feet of swinging rope, a bridge." Tom said, "What material?" I said, "What's the longest rigid object in this building?" Tom and Walt answered simultaneously, "The kitchen's stainless steel work tables." The kitchen had 3 long work tables, the kind you see in professional kitchens, heavy gauge stainless steel, each 12 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, with a small lip on the edge. Built to take enormous punishment. They weighed approximately 200 pounds each, which was a problem in terms of moving them, but less of a problem than I initially thought, because they had locking casters on the bottom, meaning they could be wheeled. 12 feet long. The gap was 12 feet. I did not celebrate this out loud. I said, We need to get one of these from the kitchen to the 5th floor east corridor window. That means through the service corridor, up the stairs, down the 5th floor corridor. Tom said that's the stair widths. The tables are 2.5 feet wide. The service stairwell is 3 feet wide at the narrowest. It'll be tight. I said, but possible. He said, if we tilt them, maybe. We'd have to, yes, possibly. I said, we start planning the logistics today. The execution, tonight or tomorrow morning, depending on the lobby situation. Patrick was already on his phone checking the lobby camera. He said, Chief, the lobby glass. He showed me. The right panel of the front double doors was separated from its frame at the top right corner. Not broken, separated. A gap had opened between the glass and the frame. You could see it on the camera, the light coming through differently in that corner. Donna would have called it a structural integrity failure of the seal. Tom said, when I described it to him, hours, not days. I said, tonight. The day of preparing for the escape was the longest day. 14 hours of logistical work while simultaneously managing 42 people who were on day 3 of no real information, reduced food, minimal sleep, and a growing awareness that the world outside was not going to be fixed before they got out. I organized it in layers. First layer, movement preparation. Tom and I, with Bobby and Gary Sherwood, did the test run of getting a work table through the service corridors and up the stairs. It took 45 minutes and required tilting the table at severe angles in the stairwell turns and a significant amount of muffled swearing from Tom, but we got it done. We got the table to the 5th floor east corridor and staged it near the window. Second layer, supply preparation. Walt had organized the remaining food into carry loads. Each person would carry a bag, capacity based on what they could actually move, containing 3 days' worth of compact food. Canned goods were heavy, and we couldn't take everything. Walt prioritized calorie-dense things, canned beans and rice pouches, and the sealed deli meats, and dried fruit from the hotel's conference room coffee service stock, which nobody had looted yet, because nobody had known it was there. Gretchen had found it in the event storage. Each bag also had a water bottle. The kitchen had a supply of commercial water, 2 cases of individual bottles, which wasn't enough for 42 people for more than a day, but was something. Third layer, the physical infirm, Audrey Pierce, and 2 other older guests who had mobility issues. I talked to each of them directly. Audrey was completely willing to do whatever was required, in the same tone she had used when asking about food after Dennis had her cornered. One of the other 2, a man named Harold Briggs who had come with his wife to the party and who had a cardiac history and had been having a rough couple of days physically. I asked Donna to assess him. She said he was stable, but that exertion at height was a risk. I said, what kind of risk? She said, worth taking versus the alternative. The third person was Frank Delaney, who had twisted his ankle on the stairs Saturday and was now limping. Not severely, but limping. He would need assistance. Fourth layer, the logistics of getting 42 people across a 12-foot gap on a stainless steel work table on the 5th floor of a hotel at approximately 4 in the morning. This was the part I spent the most time on, because it was the part with the most variables. Here is what I concluded. The table would need to be anchored on both sides. On the hotel side, we could anchor it to the window frame. Tom had the hardware and the confidence to do this, running securing straps through the inner frame structure. On the garage side, it would need to be anchored to the concrete pillar or the garage floor. This was the problem, because the garage side was not in our control. We'd have to get someone over first, with the anchoring hardware, before the rest could cross. Bobby Nix said, I'll go first. I looked at him, 22 years old. He said, I'm the youngest, I'm the lightest. If something goes wrong with the table, I'm the best one to deal with it. I said, have you ever done anything at height before? He said, I'm from Johnstown. I climbed every steel structure in that town before I was 15. I said, that's not the same. He said, Chief, I'll go first. Tell me what to tie. I told Tom to show him the knots. The 5th thing I organized, the thing I hadn't told the general group yet, What to do if the lobby glass failed before we were ready. We'd worked out a secondary holding area, the service stairwell above the 5th floor, cut off from the south stairwell, only accessible through the north route. If things came in through the lobby before we were ready to cross, we went up, not across. And the 6th layer, who goes in what order across the table? I had worked this out with Carla. Bobby first, to anchor, then Donna, because if Donna was across, she could help receive on the far side, and also because she was my wife, and yes, I was taking care of that. I'm not ashamed of it. Then the mobility-limited guests. Then the general group in organized clusters of 4, each cluster with one physically strong person. Then Tom and Gary. Then Carla. Then Patrick. Then me. 42 people. I was going last. This was not bravery. It was logistics. The person managing the flow goes last because they're the one who knows what's left. Here's the thing about the sabotage. The last act, the one I need to explain. Sunday afternoon, 4 p.m. I had found Carla and was going over the order of crossing when Mike found me and said, in the specific quiet voice he used when things were very wrong, "Someone's been in the kitchen." I went. The kitchen was locked. We had kept it locked since the Saturday kitchen run, with Tom holding the key. The lock was intact. But inside, Tom's padlock on the walk-in refrigerator was broken. The door hung open. The cold inside had been diminishing since Saturday, because the electrical grid had been running on reduced overnight power mode, and the refrigeration units were cycling. The food inside was still cold but warming. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the dairy. The dairy was gone. All of it. The butter blocks, the cream containers, the large blocks of cheese, the milk jugs. Gone. Not eaten on site. There was no mess, no wrappers, no indication of hasty consumption, just gone. Also gone, the 6 loaves of bread. I stood in the walk-in and thought about what this meant. The dairy was going to go bad soon regardless. It was the reason Walt had planned to use it first. It didn't represent a long-term food loss. But the bread was day 1 food, the most immediately accessible calories we had, and the most portable. And someone had taken it. Tom said, "Someone brought the dairy and the bread somewhere." I said, "Yes." He said, "To themselves. Stockpiling." I said, "Or they were planning to leave, and they took supplies." We both looked at the same time toward the east corridor. Toward the east emergency exit. The east emergency exit, which had had its camera covered and restored mysteriously, which had a chain on it with a key I held, which I had checked 3 times and found secure. I said, "Tom, has anyone been in the kitchen today except you and Walt?" He said, "Walt was here at 7 to start the morning soup. I was here at noon for inventory. Nobody else that I know of." I said, "Could someone have gotten in here without the key?" He said, "The windows in the kitchen are external facing. Too small to climb through. The only door is this one." He paused. "Unless the heck duct access in the ceiling, the one that connects to the 4th floor mechanical room. In theory, it's not a big duct, but if someone were small enough." I looked at the heck back duct panel in the kitchen ceiling. It was a standard removable panel, 2 foot by 2 foot. I looked at it for a second. I said, "Who's small enough?" Tom said immediately, "Lena, the server." Lena Doyle, 24 years old. EMT background. Had been quiet since the beginning, helpful when asked, not drawing attention. I found Donna and said, "Has Lena been where you expected her to be today?" Donna said, "She was with the medical group this morning. I haven't seen her since about noon." I said, "Is that unusual?" She said, "I assumed she was with the general group." She looked at me. "What's happened?" I said, "Food is missing from the kitchen. I think someone has been moving supplies." Donna was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I had a thought earlier, just a small thing. When I went to the bathroom at around 1, the east corridor bathroom, I could have sworn I heard something from the east exit area. But when I went to check, nothing. I found Lena at 5:30. She was not hiding. She was sitting in the small mechanical room near the east emergency exit, the one with the HVAC controls, with the loaves of bread and the dairy, and something else. A bag. Not a hotel bag. A personal duffel bag that she had apparently had with her, or accessed from somewhere in the building. The bag had food in it, the food from the kitchen, and a keychain, not the hotel key I held, but a duplicate that she'd clearly had from before. She looked up at me. She didn't look afraid. She looked like someone who had been expecting this conversation. I said, "Lena." She said, "I know." I said, "The dairy, the bread, the generator drain, the camera." She said, "The generator drain and the camera were mine." Yes, the stairwell door. I didn't know about that. That wasn't me. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I was going to leave." I said, "With all the food?" She said, "Not all of it. Enough for—" She stopped. She looked at the bag. She said, "I have a daughter. She's 8. She was at a sleepover at a friend's house on Friday night. In Shadyside. Her name is Natalie." I sat down across from her on the floor of the mechanical room. She said, "I got a message from my neighbor, Mrs. Kaplowitz. Lives next door to where Natalie was staying, at about 8 p.m. Friday. It said they were sheltering. They were fine, but the friend's family didn't have much food. Natalie has a peanut allergy. She has a severe one. The EpiPen is at my apartment. I told Natalie before the sleepover that she didn't need it. It was just one night." Her voice was steady, very steady. The way you keep a voice steady when you've been keeping it steady for 3 days. "I've been trying to leave since Friday night. I tried the front doors first. They were locked. Then I figured out the emergency exits. That's when I saw the chain. I didn't know why the chain was there. I thought if I drained the generator it would make things worse inside, and maybe people would decide to leave." I said, "You were trying to force a mass exit." She said, "Yes, and I covered the east camera because I was going to cut the chain and go. And then I found out I couldn't find the bolt cutters." I said, "Because I had them." She said, "Because you had them." She looked at me. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I just have to get to my daughter." I sat there. I thought about this for a long time. Longer than was comfortable for either of us. I said, "Shadyside is 3 miles from here." She said, "I know." I said, "On foot, through those streets." She said, "I know." I said, "Lena." I took a breath. "We're going out tonight. Not through the east exit, not alone, not 3 miles on foot, but we're going out. We're going through the parking garage, and from the parking garage to Garrison Street, which runs south. Shadyside is southeast." She looked at me. I said, "I'm not leaving you behind, but I'm also not letting you go out alone into those streets, because you have a daughter and she needs you alive." She said, "How can you?" I said, "We'll figure it out. We'll get to the garage. From the garage we go south. Once we're in the garage and out of the hotel's footprint, some people can split off toward—" I thought about the map of Pittsburgh, Shadyside, the garage, Garrison Street. There's a route through the back blocks that avoids the main street, quieter, less of them, if we move quietly. She said, "You can't take 40 people to Shadyside." I said, "No, but I can take you and 2 or 3 others who make sense going that way. Once we're in the garage and it's clear." She looked at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was more like someone who has been pushing against something very hard, suddenly not having to push anymore. She let out a breath, and it was long, and it had a lot of days in it. I said, "I need you to put the food back. I need you to tell me about every locked door you touched and every system you accessed. And I need you in the group tonight, doing exactly what I tell you, because we can't afford mistakes." She said, "Okay." I said, "Your daughter's name is Natalie." She said, "Yes." I said, "We'll get there." I told the group at 7 p.m. Sunday. I told them everything, finally, all of it, including the full story of Patrick and the doors and Dennis and the government call. I told them about Lena and why she'd done what she'd done. I did not editorialize. I put it down in sequence: date, time, location, what happened, who was involved. When I was done, There was a silence in the stairwell, and then several people talking at once, and then Carla's voice cutting through. Questions after. Movement plans now. God, I trained her well. I told them the plan. The work table bridge, the parking garage, the covered walkway at the 4th level, the secondary route through the office building to the South Street, the timeline, 4 a.m. The questions were a lot. I answered them in the order they mattered. Audrey Pierce asked the one that cut through everything, which was, what happens if the lobby glass goes before 4 a.m.? I said, we move faster. She said, all right. Frank Delaney said, I can't walk 12 feet on a table at height. My ankle. I said, you cross with 2 people, 1 on each side, holding you. You do not look down. You focus on the wall ahead. He said, what if I... Donna said, Frank, you've driven drunk on the highway. You can cross a table. He said, that's different. She said, it really isn't. He went quiet. Bobby Nix was already talking to Tom about the anchoring hardware. Gary Sherwood was going through the supply bags, checking weights. Walt was in the kitchen doing final food preparation. Patrick was on the cameras, watching everything that moved on the 12 feeds. At 9 p.m., Patrick radioed me. He said, Chief, the lobby, it's going. I went to his office and looked at the screen. The right panel of the front entrance had completely separated from its frame at the top right corner. The gap was now 3 to 4 inches. Through the gap, you could see light from inside the lobby illuminating the area, and the things outside were moving toward the light, not pushing against the glass uniformly anymore. Drawn to the gap specifically, their faces and hands moving toward the opening. And then, as I watched, the glass panel shifted. It didn't shatter. It moved. The whole panel, still intact as a unit, slid sideways in its frame. 3 inches. 6 inches. One of them put its hand through the gap at the top. I said, all right, we go now. Patrick said, it's 9 p.m. I said, I know. He said, we planned for 4 a.m. because... I said, I know, go. I hit the radio. Everyone up, we're moving now. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos, which is the best you can hope for when you're moving 42 people through a hotel at 9 p.m., with a lobby in the process of being breached. I want to be clear about why it worked as well as it did, because people had spent the previous 12 hours thinking about their role in it. Carla had gone over the crossing order with each cluster. Tom had walked the route 3 times. Bobby had the anchoring straps memorized. Walt and Gretchen had the supply bags staged and ready. We moved from the stairwell up to the 5th floor in under 6 minutes. The north stairwell was fast and quiet. We had drilled quiet over the past 3 days. Learned it the way you learn anything under pressure, by necessity. No talking. Hand signals that Carla had established on Saturday. The work table was staged at the end of the 5th floor east corridor, already at the window. Tom had the window open, a casement type that swung fully out, giving a clear opening of about 30 inches wide and the full height of the window, which was maybe 4 feet. The gap outside, 12 feet of open air, was visible when you stood at the window. The concrete of the parking garage 4th level across the way. The drop below, going down 4 floors to the alley. From below, up through the alley, we could hear them. Not many, not a large number, but some, moving on the ground. Bobby Nix looked at the gap and said, okay, and that was the only thing he said before he climbed onto the windowsill. Tom and Gary Sherwood had the table's near end secured to the window frame with the ratchet straps Tom had found in the maintenance supply. It wasn't elegant. It looked like something from a hardware store nightmare, but the straps were 400-pound rated, and Tom had tested the window frame and said it would hold. Bobby had the other end of the straps, the ones that would anchor the far side. He had a harness Tom had improvised from the rope, essentially a loop around his chest, with a long tail that someone would hold from the hotel side, as a backup in case he slipped. He got on the table. He looked down once. He looked up. He walked across. 12 feet. Took him maybe 8 seconds. He didn't rush, and he didn't hesitate. He stepped off on the far side, turned, and gave us a thumbs up. He anchored the far end of the table. Tom tested the tension from the hotel side. He said, "It's good." Donna crossed second. She looked at the gap, and then she looked at me and said, "Don't be long," and crossed the table at a steady pace, with her hands not quite out at her sides, balanced. She made it look manageable, which I think was intentional. Audrey was fourth. 2 people went before her, and then Bobby on the other side, and Gary on the hotel side walked her across, 1 on each arm, her cane folded and tucked under Bobby's arm. She walked across a 12-foot stainless steel work table over a 4-story drop at age 67, with a replaced hip, and when she got to the other side, she said, "Well, that was something." The crossing took 35 minutes, 42 people. The work table held. 3 people needed 2-person assistance. Audrey, Harold Briggs. Donna was waiting on the other side and talked him through the whole thing in the voice she used for frightened patients. And Frank Delaney, who did not look down and held on to Gary and Bobby simultaneously and made it across with his jaw clenched so tight I could see it from the hotel side. I went last. I stood at the window and looked at the 5th floor east corridor. The blue and gold balloon Carla had carried up from the stairwell, still tied to a handle somewhere, drifting in the air current from the open window. The hotel I had spent 30 years in. I could hear, from somewhere below, the sound of the lobby glass finally giving, not a shatter, more of a heavy shifting sound, something large settling wrong. I crossed the table. 8 seconds. The air in the alley below came up to me, cold, smelling of a city in distress. The concrete pillar on the other side was solid under my hands. Bobby unclipped the far anchors. Tom, the last person on the hotel side, pushed the table sideways from the window, letting it drop into the alley. It hit with a sound that rang through the gap, and for a moment, we all went still, waiting for the response. 30 seconds. 45. The sounds in the alley below shifted, but didn't come toward us. The table had landed with a single impact, and then gone quiet, and they were drawn to continuous sound, not single impacts. The impact registered, and then faded. I said, very quietly, "4th floor walkway. Move." The parking garage 4th level was open on the sides, just a low concrete barrier between you and the drop. It was dark. The structure's lighting had been on emergency backup, half the fluorescents clicking and sputtering, and several had died entirely. We moved in a line, keeping to the interior away from the open edges, quietly. The walkway connector to the adjacent office building was at the far end of the 4th level. A glass and steel enclosed bridge, maybe 40 feet long. The door on the garage side had a standard push bar. It was unlocked. Patrick's code for the office building side, the one he'd found in their system, got us through that door too. We were in the office building. Dark, empty, deserted since whenever everyone had been told to stay home. The smell of recycled office air and cheap carpet and whatever someone had left in a break room microwave. We went down 3 flights of stairs to ground level. The office building's south entrance opened onto a side street. Through the glass of the south entrance door, I could see the street. It was not clear. There were some of them on the far side, moving along the opposite sidewalk, but not many. 4, 5, moving slowly, their attention on something further south. I said, to the full group, "We're going south. We stay on this side of the street. No sound. Close together. There's a route south that avoids the main corridors. We move in 3 clusters, each with a strong person at front and back." Carla had the clusters organized. She had been organizing them while we moved through the garage. Lena was beside me. I said quietly to her, "South for 4 blocks. Then we split. Donna and Gary and Lena. You 3 are going with Lena, toward Shadyside. South by east. Stick to the side streets." Donna looked at me. I said, "I'll be right behind with the main group." She said, "Where are you taking the main group?" I said, "The park. Frick Park. High ground, low transit density. Enough tree cover. We find the nature center, use it as a base. Then we figure out the next step." She said, "That's 4 miles. I said, "Yes." She said, "Ray." I said, 4 miles. We've got the dark and we've got the quiet. We're going to take back streets all the way." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Don't be stupid about intersections." I said, "When have I ever?" She said, "Multiple times, at multiple intersections. Go." We came out of the office building at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, April 21st. 3 days, 4 hours, and 40 minutes after the start of my retirement party. The door opened. The street was there. The city was there, damaged and changed and dark in places, and on fire in places, and loud in the wrong directions. But there. Bobby was the first one out. He held the door. He looked both directions and said, "Clear left. 1 or 2 on the right, far end." The first cluster moved out. Carla at the front, 4 people behind her. They moved along the building wall, keeping close, moving at a steady pace that wasn't a run. The second cluster, the third. Audrey with her cane, between Gary and one of the other stronger guests, moving as fast as she could manage and managing impressively. Donna with Lena and Gary. They came to my shoulder. Donna touched my arm without saying anything. Lena had her bag and her face was set toward southeast. I said, "Natalie's going to be fine." Lena didn't answer, but she nodded once, and then they were moving. I stood at the door and watched the last cluster file out. I was the last person in the building. It was empty behind me. The office building, the walkway, the parking garage, and across 30 feet of alley, the Hartfield Grand Hotel, which was 12 stories of gray stone and old windows, and, if the lobby glass had fully failed in the last 40 minutes, something new moving through its corridors. I looked at it, the building, my building, for 30 years. The Congratulations Chief banner was on the 4th floor, in the north stairwell, still tied to a railing. I let the door close behind me and joined the group. I want to tell you what happened on the walk. Not in full. The full version would take as long as the walk itself, 4 miles through a Pittsburgh that had become something I recognized only in structure, in street layout, in the placement of buildings I had passed 1,000 times. The feel of it was gone. The city that hums with people, the cars, the voices, the specific background frequency of a city that knows it is alive, that was gone. What replaced it was the sound of a city that did not know what it was anymore. Distant fire, something industrial, a generator or a compressor, running without its usual purpose. And the other sounds, the ones that had no good name. But the walk. We moved slowly and quietly, and with discipline that I think surprised me. How well 40 people can learn to be quiet, when quiet is the thing that keeps them alive. Carla was brilliant on the front of the group, reading the street ahead, signaling to stop or go. Gary was remarkable at the rear, quiet and watchful, ex-military instincts operating without his having to think about them. We had 3 close calls. The first, on Halkett Street. A cluster of 8 or 9 of them was moving across the intersection ahead, and we froze against a building wall and waited in the dark, not moving, not breathing loud, for about 4 minutes, while they crossed and went down the side street. Nobody panicked. Nobody made a sound. I was watching Audrey Pierce during those 4 minutes, and she was standing perfectly still against the wall with her cane grounded and her eyes forward, and the expression of someone who has decided that being afraid was a choice she wasn't going to make. The second. 2 of them were in a doorway on Boulevard of the Allies, just inside the alcove of a shuttered restaurant. We passed within 15 feet. Neither of them responded to our movement. They were standing facing the wall, which I did not understand then, and don't fully understand now. Something about the lack of stimulus sends them into a kind of stasis. Not sleep, just a stopped state. We moved past, and they didn't turn. The third was more difficult. A larger group, 12 to 15, was in the intersection of Bates and Belfield, moving in a loose circle that didn't seem to have direction. We had to take an alternate route, which added 6 blocks and 40 minutes, and took us through an area of small commercial buildings that were dark and unfamiliar to me. Tom Garrity, who grew up in that part of the city, led that section from memory. We reached Frick Park at 2:15 a.m. The park's nature center is a single-story stone building near the main entrance. It had been closed for the season, still had its winter hours posted on the door. The lock took Tom's skills and a little time. But not much, because Tom knows locks, the way he knows everything mechanical, from the inside out. We got 38 people inside, and got the doors closed behind us. 38, not 42. Donna and Gary and Lena were 4 blocks into their Shadyside route when we split. And 2 of the guests had separated from the group during the 3rd close call. Not by choice, exactly, but in the confusion of the alternate route they had gone 1 block the wrong way, and by the time we realized, going back was riskier than them finding their own way. I don't know what happened to them. I have to hold that. That's what a sequence of events person does. You write down what you know, and you mark what you don't know yet. The Nature Center had an emergency supply cabinet in the back room. Donna would have loved this. It was a public building and it had emergency supplies, a requirement under the county's Civic Preparedness Code. 12 gallons of water in sealed containers, a first aid kit, 2 emergency blankets, some dried food packets for park events. Not much, but something. Walt organized what we had brought. Carla organized the sleeping arrangements. The Nature Center had a classroom space and a storage room and a main hall and enough floor for 38 people to lie down without being on top of each other. I sat on the floor of the main hall. Bobby Nix sat down next to me. He said, "We made it." I said, 38 of us did. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Were you scared? On the table?" I said, "During the table crossing?" "No." "During the walk?" "Yes." "When the group was split at Belfield?" "Yes." He said, "You didn't look it." I said, "Bobby, that is the most important lie I know how to tell." He laughed, not loudly. I said, "Go sleep. You went first across a 12-foot drop. You've earned it." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Sit here for a bit." He said, "You should sleep too." I said, "I know." He went. I sat in the Nature Center, listening to 37 people breathe in various stages of sleep or near sleep. The sounds of the park outside, which were the sounds of nature doing what it does regardless of what is happening to the people around it. Birds somewhere, something in the grass, the wind in the trees. And I thought about the cake. The 3-tier cake on the stainless steel counter in Walt's kitchen. 30 years. Donna's message came through at 6:14 a.m. Monday morning. 1 bar of signal, which must have connected through some relay that was still functioning. It came as a text, and it said, "Found Natalie. She is fine. Also found 2 EpiPens in neighbor's medicine cabinet." We asked. "Lena is with her daughter. We are sheltering at neighbor's house. 3 adults and child. Supplies for 5 days. Gary is here. Send location when you can. We are okay. Love, D." I read it twice. 3 times. I sat holding my phone and read it 3 times, and then I put it down and looked at the ceiling of the Nature Center, which was standard drop tile and completely unremarkable. The backup cake was in the refrigerator at our house, which was 8 miles from the Nature Center. 8 miles. In this new world, 8 miles was not nothing. 8 miles was a plan, not a trip. But 8 miles was also the difference between now and later. And later, with good decisions and good people and a wife who makes backup cakes, seemed possible. It seemed possible. I wrote back, "Nature Center, Frick Park, 38 people. Situation managed. Come when safe. Love, R." I sent it and waited, and then a single tick turned into a double tick, and I put the phone in my pocket. Roger Vidal was awake, sitting nearby, watching me. I said, "My wife found the girl." He said, "Natalie?" I said, "Natalie." He said, "Good." He looked at his own phone. "My wife. I still haven't heard." I said, "Send again. Signal is up." He typed. He sent. He looked at the double tick and then up at me. I said, "Keep the phone charged. The Nature Center has a solar charger in the emergency cabinet." He said, "You found a solar charger in the emergency cabinet?" I said, "Tom found it at 3 in the morning. Tom finds things." He nodded. He settled back against the wall with his phone. I looked around the main hall. 37 people in various positions. Walt, on his back near the supply boxes, sleeping with the deep authority of a man who has been cooking food at scale for 3 days and has now stopped. Tom Garrity, on his side with his keyring visible from his pocket, 112 keys to a building we had just left. Bobby, asleep near the door, which I thought was instinct. Audrey Pierce, sitting upright in a chair that someone had pulled out of the classroom. She said she couldn't sleep on the floor. Her hip wouldn't let her, with her eyes closed but her cane in her hand. Not asleep exactly, but resting. Carla, on her feet, doing a quiet walk of the perimeter. Because she is not a person who sleeps when there are perimeter questions open. Patrick Holt, in the corner, with his laptop on his knees, still trying to access systems, still watching, still working. 42 people had gone into my retirement party. 38 had made it to Frick Park. 4 others were out there somewhere, in a version of the city that was different from the one they'd known. The math of a thing like this, I don't know how to do that math. I spent 30 years writing incident reports that had clean outcomes, clear causes, identified resolutions. A thing happened, the thing was addressed, the thing was resolved. This one doesn't have that shape. The shape of this is still open. The lobby glass of the Hartfield Grand is on the floor, and the building has been compromised, and 38 people are in a nature center on a Monday morning in April, and the Portugal binder is on my kitchen counter 8 miles east. I'm not done. I understand that. The sequence of events continues. I'm just at the point in the report where I've run out of the events I have confirmed information about, and I've started into the part that's still in progress. What I know, the people around me are alive. The decisions that kept them alive were made by many hands, most of them not mine. Patrick Holt, who made a terrible and possibly correct choice in a phone call with a government official, who may not have had our best interests in mind. Lena Doyle, who sabotaged us out of a love so specific it had a name. Natalie, 8 years old, peanut allergy, shady side. Bobby Nix, who walked across 12 feet of stainless steel over a 4-story drop at 9 p.m. because someone had to go first. Tom Garrity, who found the solar charger at 3 in the morning. Audrey Pierce, who sat in the dark with Dennis Farrow 4 feet away and didn't move because she'd figured out the rules of the situation without being told. And Donna, who made a backup cake. Who knew, 3 weeks before the world changed, that the main thing might not survive transport, and who made another version just in case. Who sat in a stranger's house in Shadyside with a little girl named Natalie and her mother and 2 EpiPens and 5 days of supplies and sent me 6 words, "We are okay. Love D." I'm going to be honest about Patrick now, because this is the part I said I'd come back to. On Monday morning, while most people were sleeping, Patrick called me over to his laptop in the corner. He said, "I need you to see something." He had been digging. In the hours after we reached the nature center, while I was watching the group sleep, he had been pushing through the government systems he'd accessed previously, the property records, the CDC-adjacent databases, the emergency operations logs. He was still in the hotel's systems remotely, watching the cameras with the cellular hotspot on his laptop. He said, "The call with Agent Whitfield, I found the CDC emergency operations log." I said, "How did you find?" He said, "I'm not going to explain that." He turned the laptop toward me. The log was a government document, and I'm not going to pretend I can verify its authenticity. I have no way to do that with any confidence. What it showed, or what Patrick said it showed, was a record of calls made to the emergency operations line from commercial properties in downtown Pittsburgh during the window of April 19th, 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. There were 17 calls. Each one was logged with a handler name. Patrick pointed to the one from the Hartfield Grand. It said, "Under resolution, quarantine maintained, containment protocol B12. He said, "Protocol B12. I said, "What is?" He pulled up another tab. He said, "I found the protocol reference in the same system. B12 is," he read from the screen, "passive containment. Maintain infected individuals within established perimeter. Do not initiate active response. Monitor and log." I looked at him. He looked at me. Passive containment. Do not initiate active response. Monitor and log. Not send help. Not deploy resources. Not rescue. Monitor and log. I said, they knew we were there. He said, yes. I said, and they? He said, the protocol response assumes natural attrition within the containment zone. Natural attrition is the language. I sat back. Natural attrition. 42 people at a retirement party, and the government response was to note our location, confirm containment was in effect, and wait for, what? Wait for however many of us were going to stop being a logistical problem. Patrick said, I don't know if Whitfield knew that. Maybe she believed the protocol meant something else. Maybe she was just following instructions and wasn't told what B12 meant. I said, maybe. He said, or maybe she knew exactly what B12 meant. I thought about the moment when she'd told him, you do not want to let that person out of that building. The certainty in that, the specificity. I said, does it change anything we've done? He said, no. I said, then it goes in the report, and we deal with what's in front of us. He said, there's a functioning emergency broadcast center. Allegheny County Emergency Management. I found an active frequency. He showed me. They're coordinating. There are rescue operations running out of a central hub in the east suburbs. Pickup points. I said, how do we contact them? He said, I'm already working on it. The Nature Center has an old emergency radio in the supply cabinet. Tom found it with the solar charger. If we can get it to transmit on this frequency. I said, Tom. He said, Tom. I went and woke Tom Garrity, who had been asleep for 35 minutes. And he woke fully in about 4 seconds, with the practiced immediacy of a man who has been on call his whole adult life. And I showed him the radio and the frequency, and he said, give me 20 minutes. It took him 14. The emergency radio went out on frequency 155.340 MHz at 8:40 a.m. Monday morning. Patrick's message was short and specific. Location, number of survivors, condition, needs. The kind of message that doesn't require drama, because the facts are dramatic enough on their own. They came back on the frequency at 9:20. A voice, a real human voice. A woman with a county emergency management ID that Patrick verified against the frequency database. She said they had our location. She said there were pickup teams operating in the area. She said to hold position and conserve resources. She said, help is coming. I had heard that before, in a different context, from a different government official, and it had not meant what it should have meant. But this voice sounded different. Less like a protocol, more like a person who was also scared but had a job to do and was doing it. I said into the radio, understood, 38 people, 2 mobility limited, 1 cardiac history, 1 medical professional on site. We have supplies for approximately 3 days. She said, copy that. Teams are moving. Stay on this frequency. I said, copy. I put the radio down. Carla was standing behind me. She had been there for most of the call. She said, do you believe them? I said, I believe some of them. The specific person on that frequency, yes, I think she means it. The system behind her. I thought about Protocol B12, that I'm less sure about. She said, so we hold position, but we keep our options open. I said, exactly. She nodded. She went back to her perimeter walk. Bobby Nix had woken up during the radio call and was sitting up, listening. He said, what happens if they don't come? I said, then we make another plan. He said, what plan? I said, that depends on what we know at the time we need it. I don't make plans for situations I don't have enough information about yet. He said, that sounds like something Howard Reeve would say. I looked at him. Did you know Howard Reeve? He said, he came in for coffee sometimes when he visited the hotel. I was a bellhop. He'd tip really well and tell me stories. He talked about you. I said, what did he say? Bobby said, he said you were the most unflappable man he'd ever worked with. He said the only thing that got to you was coffee made wrong. I said, that is completely accurate. He said, he also said, and I'm just passing this along, that you were going to be a hard act to follow. I sat with that. Howard Reeve had said that. had told a bellhop that, with his good tips and his stories. I said, he was going to be wrong about that. Carla is going to be excellent. Bobby said, I think Howard knew that. He said it like a compliment, not a criticism. I stood up. My back ached. My knees ached. Everything that had been running on adrenaline for 3 days was starting to present its invoice. I went to the supply boxes and found one of the water bottles and drank half of it, and looked out the small window of the nature center at Frick Park in the early morning. The trees still bare enough in mid-April to let the light through at low angles. The park itself quiet and completely ordinary looking. A park. Just a park. Grass and trees, and the kind of path that people walked their dogs on Sunday mornings before any of this happened. The rescue team arrived at 1:15 p.m. Monday. 2 vehicles, an armored county emergency management van and a civilian SUV that had been commandeered and was carrying 2 volunteer paramedics. The team was 6 people, 3 county EM workers, 2 paramedics, 1 police officer, who was very young and very tense, and holding his situation together through sheer professionalism. They came to the nature center door and knocked. I opened it. The team leader, a county EM man named Dave, early 40s, looked at me and said, Hartfield Grand? I said, former. We relocated. He said, how many? I said, 38. 2 mobility limited, 1 cardiac who should be seen first, 1 medical professional on site who can brief your paramedics. He said, copy. We've got capacity for 20 in the van, 20 in the second vehicle. We may need 2 trips. I said, 1 trip. We're not splitting again. He looked at me for a second. He said, the vehicles are rated. I said, we're not splitting again. A shorter pause. He said, all right, 1 trip. We loaded. I helped Audrey Pierce into the vehicle, which required some coordination, and her cane, and a step stool that one of the paramedics produced from somewhere, and she got in and settled, and looked at me and said, I want it on record, Ray Callahan, that this party went on longer than expected. I said, I'll note it in the report. She said, good, and I still haven't had my second slice of cake. I said, I'll get you a cake. She said, a good one. None of that fondant business. I said, I'll pass that along to Walt. Walt, who was loading supply boxes into the second vehicle's cargo area with his apron. He was still wearing the apron. Looked up and said, I heard that, Audrey. She said, good. Roger Vidal's wife had reached him by phone at 10 a.m. She was fine. She had sheltered at home in Squirrel Hill. She said the neighborhood was quiet. She had 3 days of groceries and neighbors she trusted. He sat in the corner with his phone for an hour after that call. Not crying, but not crying either. And nobody said anything about it, because there was nothing to say. His wife sent a second message at noon that said, I bought the wine you like. Come home. He showed me this message. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Donna and Gary and Lena and Natalie came to the rescue vehicle pickup point on a route that the county team had cleared, and they joined the second vehicle at 11:40, pulled up to the nature center, and when the door opened and Donna got out, I was already at the vehicle, and she looked at me with the expression she has worn 31 years of being married to me, which contains about 17 different things at once, and said, you didn't do anything stupid at the intersections. I said, I did exactly nothing stupid at the intersections. She said, good. Lena's daughter Natalie was 8 years old and had her mother's same dark eyes and the specific energy of a child who has been scared for 3 days and is now safe, and is expressing the release of that by talking very fast about everything. She was describing to Bobby Nix, with considerable animation, the exact series of events at the friend's house sleepover from Friday to Monday, and Bobby was listening with his full attention, nodding at the right moments, asking exactly the right questions in the right order, and I watched this from across the vehicle bay and thought, good man. Bobby Nix is a genuinely good man. Patrick was the last person in the nature center when the vehicles loaded. I found him doing a final pass through the space, checking drawers and supply cabinets, the way you check a hotel room before checkout. I said, you don't have to do that. He said, habit. I said, Patrick. He stopped checking the drawer. He looked at me. I said, whatever happens next, with the government thing, with the investigation of what the response was or wasn't, you're going to have to give your account. What you were told, what you did, why. He said, I know. I said, I'll give mine too. In writing. What I saw on those camera feeds. What you told me. The timeline. He said, you don't have to. I said, I know how to write incident reports. 30 years of practice. Let me be useful. He looked at the drawer he'd been checking, which was empty. He closed it. He said, there's a thing that's been bothering me. I said, just one? He almost smiled. He said, Agent Whitfield said she had confirmed there was an infected individual at our location. She had our location, the hotel's address. She knew Dennis was coming to the party. I said, she must have had his location data, from his phone or his... He said, I know, that's not what's bothering me. What's bothering me is, how did she know he'd been bitten? She said, confirmed bite victim. She said it with certainty. But Dennis came in through the east lobby on his own. No 911 call. No report from Liberty Avenue that named the Hartfield Grand as a destination. How did she know he was coming to the party? How did she know he'd been bitten and was heading to a specific location? I sat with that. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. That question, how did Agent Whitfield know Dennis was coming before Dennis arrived, is the stone in the shoe that I'm still carrying. Maybe Dennis called someone when he was bitten. Maybe his phone's location data was being tracked in real time by the emergency response system. Maybe there's a version of this that makes sense and is not as dark as the version my security manager brain keeps building. Maybe. I said, write it down. Everything you remember from that call. Every word. He said, I already have. I said, good. We got in the vehicle. The county emergency management compound was an old industrial building on the east side, 30 minutes from the park at the careful pace the vehicles drove, avoiding the main corridors where the concentration of infected was highest. Through the window, I watched the city pass. Familiar streets in unfamiliar states. A gas station with its windows broken and its canopy half collapsed, the front of a department store open and empty. A block of row houses that looked completely untouched, curtains drawn, so ordinary that for a moment your brain tried to tell you nothing had happened. The compound had other people. Many other people, 200 or more already, sheltering from what had happened across the city and the region beyond. It had generators and food distribution, and a medical station. It had something that looked very much like a refugee operation in the making, which was disturbing, and also, in that moment, exactly what was needed. A woman at the intake station wrote down our names, 38 names. She got to mine and I said, Ray Callahan. She said, Callahan. Hartfield Grand? I said, yes. She said, we had your location flagged from the radio contact this morning. Your group is being prioritized for medical assessment. Anyone who needs it. I said, 1 cardiac, 2 mobility limited, 1 8-year-old who's fine but has a peanut allergy. She has EpiPens. Her mother has them. Just flag it. She wrote it down. She said, is there anything else we should know? I thought about the full incident. The party, the doors, Patrick's call, the generator, Lena in the mechanical room, the crossing, the walk, the nature center, the radio. I said, I'd like to submit a full incident report when I have the time. She looked up. She said, a what? I said, an incident report, sequence of events, who was involved, what decisions were made, outcomes. I've got 30 years of practice. I can have it done by tomorrow. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, okay, yes, we'll take it. I said, good. I went to find Donna. She was near the medical station with Natalie, who was sitting on a crate eating a packet of crackers with the focused intensity of a child who has discovered after 3 days of minimal food that crackers are, actually, excellent. Lena was next to her, one hand on her daughter's back, not saying anything, just there. Gary Sherwood was nearby. talking to one of the county EM staff with the authority of a man who has been useful and knows how to keep being useful. Donna saw me coming and said nothing until I reached her, and then she said, "How are your knees?" I said, "Terrible." She said, "I told you about those stairs." I said, "You told me about these stairs specifically?" She said, "I told you about stairs in general for the past 5 years." I said, "I will concede that you have expressed a general concern about stairs." She said, "Good, sit down." I sat on a crate next to hers. Natalie looked up at me and said, "Are you the man who made the bridge?" I said, "My friend Tom made the bridge, technically." She said, "My mom said you're the man who said they would come for us." I looked at Lena. Lena was looking at her daughter. I said, "Your mom helped too." Natalie said, "She always helps," in the matter-of-fact tone of a child who considers this simply a fact about her mother, not a compliment. Just, this is a thing that is true. I said, "Yes, she does." Natalie went back to the crackers. Donna put her hand over mine and left it there. The last thing about Patrick. He filed his own statement with the county emergency management at 3 p.m. Monday. He did it in writing, typed on his laptop, detailed, with timestamps from the call log, with the CDC protocol reference, with the log of the 17 buildings that had been given the same containment response. He gave it to the intake woman and asked her to forward it to whoever was handling the city's emergency operations review. She said, "We'll make sure it gets to the right people." He said, "I want a receipt. I want it acknowledged, in writing, that it was received." She looked at him. She said, "I'll do that personally." He nodded. He came back to where the Hartfield group was gathered and sat down. Bobby was telling someone, Roger Vidal, I think, the story of the table crossing, in the enthusiastic and slightly embellished way that someone who is 22 and has just done something terrifying does when they're safely on the other side of it. Patrick listened. He didn't say anything. I sat down next to him. I said, "You did the right thing." He said, "With the statement?" I said, "With the statement, and with the call on Friday. I've decided." He said, "You've decided." I said, "I've been going back and forth on it for 3 days, but you called the CDC, and you were told by a federal official to contain an infected individual who, if he had left that building, would have walked out into those streets with an active infection at the beginning of the outbreak. You followed that instruction. You prevented him from leaving. Dennis did not go out into the city and bite 3 people on his way home. Whatever was happening on those streets was not made worse by Dennis, specifically because you locked those doors." I said, "That part, that specific thing. I think you got right." He said, "The rest of it." I said, "The rest of it is on whoever wrote Protocol B12, not on you." He said, "I should have told you sooner. Instead of just..." I said, "Yes, you should have. And if we're ever in a building together in this situation again, you tell me immediately." He looked at me. I said, "That's not a threat. That's a policy." He said, "Understood." I said, "You're going to be fine, Patrick." He said, "I don't know that." I said, "I know, but you're going to be fine anyway." He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your retirement party." I said, "What about it?" He said, "I'm sorry about your retirement party." I said, "I've been thinking about that. I spent 30 years working security. I know everything that can go wrong in a building. I know the failure points, the access gaps, the human error patterns, the moments when a good situation becomes a bad one, and why. I had all of that knowledge." I looked around the compound, at the 38 people from the Hartfield, at the 200 others, at the county EM staff running organized chaos, at Natalie eating her crackers, at Donna's hand still on mine. And my actual last night of work was the most complicated security situation I've ever managed. In the building, I knew better than any building I've ever known, with 42 people who needed it to go right. I said, "I'm going to be honest with you, Patrick. I don't know if I would have traded it." He said, "Traded what?" I said, "A quiet retirement. A party with a 3-tier cake and speeches, and everyone going home at a reasonable hour. versus this. He said, "You'd rather have had this?" I said, "I'd rather have had the cake. But since I didn't get the cake, I'd rather have been useful." He said, You were very useful, Chief." I said, "It's Ray now. I'm retired." He looked at me. He said, "You're really not." I said, "No, I really am not." I stood up. My knees complained extensively about this, and I ignored them. I walked across the compound to where Tom Garrity was sitting with his keyring in his lap, doing what Tom did when he needed to think, counting his keys, all 112 of them. I said, "Tom." He looked up. I said, "Thank you for the generator and the measurements and the table and the radio and everything." He said, "I'm a facilities man. It's what I do." I said, "No, it's what you did. In that building, in those specific circumstances, for those specific people. That's different from just what you do." He looked at his keys. He said, "Most of these don't unlock anything anymore." I said, "Keep them anyway." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because you counted them once, and the number matters, and because we're going back to get Audrey Pierce her cake, and when we do, we're going to need someone who knows how to open a building." He looked at me. He said, "You're serious?" I said, "I'm retired. I have nothing but time and extremely strong opinions about unfulfilled cake promises." He laughed. Actually laughed. A real one. Not a stress release. A real laugh. I went back to Donna. I sat down and she handed me half a packet of crackers, and I ate them, and they were, objectively, the best crackers I have ever had, and I thought about Portugal, and the binder, and Lisbon, and whether all of that was still possible, and I thought, yes. Maybe the world gets this bad and you come out the other side and Portugal is still there, and the binder is still on the counter, and the backup cake is in the refrigerator, and you go. Maybe. I'm going to find out. That's the sequence of events. April 19th, Friday, 7 p.m. 42 people at a retirement party for a hotel security manager who had been doing the job for 30 years and thought the hardest part of his life was behind him. April 21st, Sunday, 11:40 p.m. 38 of the same 42 people walking out of an office building on a side street, moving south through a changed city, carrying everything important on their backs. April 22nd, Monday, 1:15 p.m. 38 people in 2 vehicles, moving east, arriving at a compound that was the beginning of whatever came next. What action was taken? The logical ones, the imperfect ones, the ones made under pressure by people who were trying their best, with incomplete information in impossible circumstances. Outcomes, known and unknown, documented and still open. Incident resolution, ongoing. I'm Ray Callahan, retired security manager, Hartfield Grand Hotel.